She knocked at midnight and he almost didn't answer. Jonas Mercer thought he'd buried Mercy with his wife, until a collapsing stranger in the snow forced him to choose. Become the stone Wyoming's wind carved him into, or risk everything on a woman the whole territory whispered was a killer. What happened next didn't just change one ranch. It changed what home meant when the past came hunting and winter showed no mercy. Stay until the end and comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. The wind had teeth that night, not the gentle kind that rustled through summer grass or carried the scent of wildflowers across open prairie. This was the Wyoming wind that carved bone, that turned men's faces to leather, that made widows out of wives and ghosts out of homesteads. It screamed across the Holloway Ranch like something alive and angry, rattling the shutters Jonas Mercer had reinforced 3 times that month, shaking the very foundations of the log house his grandfather had built with hands that knew hardship the way other men knew comfort. Jonas sat in his dead wife's rocking chair, the one she'd loved because it faced the window where she could watch the sunset paint the mountains gold. Now it faced nothing but darkness and his own reflection, a haunted, hollow-eyed man of 32 who looked 50 in the lamplight. In his arms, 8-month-old Ella screamed with the kind of fury only infants possess, that raw, primal sound that cut through a man's defenses and found the soft places he thought he'd armored over. "I know, little bird," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He'd spoken more words to this baby in the past 3 months than to any living soul. "I know you want your mama. God knows I want her too." The fire in the stone hearth was dying. He needed to add wood, but Ella wouldn't settle, wouldn't take the bottle he'd prepared with shaking hands, wouldn't do anything but wail her grief into the storm. She didn't understand that Catherine was gone, that the fever had taken her so fast Jonas hadn't even had time to ride to town for the doctor, that he'd held his wife's hand while she burned up from the inside, whispering promises he couldn't keep about watching over their daughter, about not letting the ranch fall to ruin, about not becoming the bitter, broken thing his own father had become after Jonas's mother passed. He'd failed at most of those promises already. The ranch was struggling. The cattle had gotten sick last month. Not all of them, thank Christ, but enough that he'd had to put down 6 head and sell 8 more at a loss just to pay what he owed at the feed store. The winter had come early and hard, trapping him here with a baby who wouldn't stop crying and memories that wouldn't stop cutting. His nearest neighbor, old Samuel Pritchett, lived 5 miles east and hadn't visited since the funeral. Nobody had. That was the way of things out here. Everyone had their own survival to worry about, their own battles with the wind and the cold and the loneliness that could drive a man to madness if he let it. Jonas wasn't going to let it. He'd made Catherine that promise, at least, standing over her grave in the rocky soil behind the house while Ella slept against his chest, blissfully unaware that her world had just shattered. He'd promised he'd survive this, that he'd raise their daughter right, that he'd keep the ranch running somehow, even if it killed him. Most days he thought it might. The clock on the mantel, Catherine's grandmother's clock, brought all the way from Pennsylvania in a wagon that had broken down twice, showed 11:43. Ella's cries had subsided to hiccuping whimpers, her tiny fists clutching at his shirt like she was afraid he'd disappear too. He hummed tunelessly, some half-remembered lullaby Catherine used to sing, and watched the fire slowly consume the last log. He should get up, add wood, check the barn doors. The wind was strong enough tonight to tear them clean off their hinges if they weren't properly secured, but exhaustion weighed on him like wet wool, heavy and suffocating. He'd been up since before dawn, mucking stalls and repairing fence line, and trying to figure out how he was going to make it through winter with half the supplies he needed and no help coming. The wind howled louder, and Ella stirred against his chest, whimpering. "Shh," he whispered. "Just the wind, little bird. Just the wind pretending it's something worse." That's when the knocking came. 3 sharp raps against the heavy oak door, deliberate, insistent, cut through the wind like a knife through silk. Jonas froze. Nobody knocked at midnight in Wyoming territory. Nobody traveled in weather like this unless they were running from something or running toward death, and most often those were the same thing. The nearest town, Redemption, was 12 miles southwest, and even the circuit preacher knew better than to ride in a storm like this. Ella had gone quiet, her dark eyes wide, as if she too sensed the wrongness of it. The knock came again, Same rhythm, same force. 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo in Jonas's chest. He stood slowly, settling Ella in the wooden cradle beside the chair. Catherine had spent weeks sanding and painting it, decorating it with tiny blue flowers that matched her eyes. The baby started to fuss, but he couldn't hold her and handle what might be outside. Not safely. His rifle hung above the mantel. He took it down, checked the chamber out of habit, and moved toward the door with the careful steps of a man who'd learned young that caution kept you breathing. Through the small window beside the door, he could see nothing but darkness and snow, the storm so thick it looked like the world had been erased. "Who's there?" His voice came out harder than he intended, sharp with suspicion, and the kind of fear that made men dangerous. No answer, just the wind, and then, "Please." A woman's voice, barely audible over the storm. "Please, I just need—" Another gust swallowed her words. Jonas's hand tightened on the rifle. A woman, alone, in this storm. Every instinct screamed trap. He'd heard the stories same as everyone, outlaws using women as bait, drawing good men outside where partners waited in the darkness with guns and bad intentions. Last year, a rancher up near Buffalo had opened his door to a crying woman and ended up shot, his house ransacked, his winter stores stolen. But he'd also heard his wife's voice in his head, clear as the day she'd spoken the words, "Don't become stone, Jonas. Don't let this hard country make you so hard you can't feel another person's need." That had been 2 years ago, when a drifter had shown up asking for work, and Jonas had nearly run him off at gunpoint. Catherine had insisted they at least give the man a meal. Turned out he'd been a former soldier, good with horses, and he'd stayed on 3 months before moving west. Honest man, hard worker. Would have been a mistake to turn him away. But Catherine was gone now, and Jonas had Ella to think about. His daughter. His responsibility. His whole damn world compressed into 8 pounds of helpless humanity that depended on him for everything. "I can work," the voice came again, stronger now, fighting the wind. "I don't want charity. I can earn my keep, please. I'll freeze out here," Jonas cursed under his breath. He cracked the door open, rifle raised, peering out into the storm. She stood about 10 feet back from the porch, as if she knew better than to crowd a man's threshold uninvited. The snow had already covered her shoulders, turning her into something almost ghostly in the lamplight that spilled from the doorway. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair plastered to her face and eyes that held something worse than cold. Desperation. The kind that made people do stupid, dangerous things. She wore no coat, just a thin dress that might have been blue or gray once, but now looked like nothing but shadow and ice. Her hands were wrapped in what looked like torn strips of cloth, and even from here, he could see she was shaking so hard her teeth clattered. "Where's your horse?" Jonas called out, still not lowering the rifle. "Dead. 3 miles back. Broke his leg in a ravine." "Your wagon?" "Never had one." "Where are you coming from?" She hesitated, and that hesitation told him more than words could. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't weather. "South," she finally said. "Town called Bitter Creek." Jonas knew Bitter Creek. Rough place, mining town that had played out 5 years ago and now served as little more than a haven for men who didn't want to be found and women who'd lost everything worth holding on to. If she was from there, she was running from something bad. "Turn out your pockets," he ordered. She did, pulling out the empty fabric to show she carried nothing, no weapons. No money. Nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever desperation had driven her into a storm that could kill. Behind him, Ella started crying again, that piercing wail that made Jonas's chest ache. The woman's eyes flickered toward the sound, something softening in her face. "You have a baby." "That's my business. I've cared for children before. I could help. I'm good with infants. I could... Lady, I don't know you from Eve, and you show up at midnight in a storm with no horse, no supplies, and a story that's got more holes than my barn roof. Give me one good reason I shouldn't close this door right now and let the storm take you where it will." The words came out cruel, crueler than he meant them, but this was survival. This was the calculus of the frontier. Trust the wrong person and end up dead. Simple as that. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something break behind her eyes. Not tears. Something deeper. The last fragment of pride, maybe, or hope, or whatever it was that kept people fighting when everything else was gone. "You shouldn't," she said quietly. "You should close that door. You should protect your child and your home and not let someone like me anywhere near either one. You're right to be suspicious. You're right about everything." She turned away then, stumbling down off the porch and back into the storm. Jonas stood there, door half open, rifle in hand, watching her walk away. Every rational part of his brain said to let her go, said she was trouble, that whatever she was running from would follow her here, that opening his home to a stranger was asking for disaster. But Ella was still crying, and the wind was still howling, and Catherine's voice was still echoing in his head. "Don't become stone." The woman made it maybe 20 feet before she collapsed. Not dramatically, there was nothing theatrical about it. Her legs just gave out, folding beneath her like they'd finally accepted what her mind refused to acknowledge. She fell forward into the snow and didn't get back up. "Christ almighty," Jonas muttered. He should leave her, should go back inside, tend to his daughter, let nature take its course. That's what his father would have done. What most men out here would do. The frontier didn't have room for mercy, not the impractical kind that got you killed. But he found himself setting the rifle against the doorframe and stepping out into the storm anyway. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, finding every gap in his clothing with malicious precision. The snow was already ankle-deep on the porch, knee-deep in the yard, and it took him longer than it should have to reach her. She'd fallen by the fence post, the one he kept meaning to replace, and lay curled on her side with her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt at warmth. "Stupid woman," he said, kneeling beside her. "Stupid, stubborn, suicidal woman." She didn't respond. Her eyes were open but unfocused, her lips blue, her whole body shaking with violent tremors that meant hypothermia was setting in fast. He'd seen it before, on cattle and men both. Once it got this far, once the shaking started like this, you didn't have much time. Jonas slipped his arms beneath her and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, like she hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel how cold she was, even through his shirt, like holding a bundle of ice. Getting back to the house felt like crossing miles instead of yards. The wind fought him every step, trying to tear them both away, to claim what it clearly thought was its due. But Jonas had been fighting this wind his whole life, and he was too damn stubborn to let it win tonight. He kicked the door shut behind them, sealing out the storm, and the sudden quiet was almost shocking. Ella's cries filled the space instead, urgent and afraid, but Jonas couldn't tend to her yet. He laid the woman on the rug in front of the fireplace, the one Catherine had braided from old clothes and burlap sacks, and threw 3 logs onto the dying embers. The flames caught quickly, throwing heat and light across the room. In the glow, he got his first real look at her. She was younger than he'd thought, early 20s at most. Her face was all sharp angles, cheekbones too prominent, jaw too defined, like she'd missed too many meals. But there was something striking about her features, something that would have been beautiful if she hadn't looked so close to death. Dark hair, nearly black, cut roughly at her shoulders, pale skin gone corpse white with cold. And her hands, he noticed her hands particularly, were torn up, fingertips raw and bleeding like she'd been climbing rocks or clawing at something. He grabbed Catherine's old shawl from the back of the rocking chair, the cream-colored one she'd worn every evening while nursing Ella, and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders. Then he pulled the quilt from his own bed and layered that on top. "Stay by the fire," he told her, though she gave no sign of hearing him. "I'll be right back." Ella's cries had reached a fever pitch. He scooped her up from the cradle, and she immediately quieted to hiccuping sobs, her small body trembling with leftover distress. He heated the bottle he'd prepared earlier, goat's milk from the nanny he kept for exactly this purpose, and settled back into the rocking chair while Ella ate with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been denied comfort too long. All the while, he watched the woman by the fire. She didn't move for long minutes. Then, slowly, her shaking began to ease. Her eyes closed. Her breathing deepened. Jonas found himself tracking each breath, part of him waiting for it to stop, for her to just slip away and solve his problem for him. But she kept breathing. Ella finished the bottle and fell asleep against his shoulder, milk-drunk and finally peaceful. Jonas sat there in the rocking chair, his daughter warm in his arms, a stranger potentially dying on his floor, and wondered what the hell he'd just invited into his home. Outside, The wind continued to rage. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, Jonas had moved through exhaustion into a strange, crystalline alertness that came from too little sleep and too much worry. He'd spent the night in the rocking chair, Ella sleeping on his chest, while he kept watch over the woman by the fire. She'd slept deeply, the sleep of complete depletion, but her color had improved. The corpse white had given way to merely pale, and the violent shaking had subsided into occasional tremors. Once, around 3 in the morning, she'd cried out, a sharp, terrified sound that made Jonas reach for his rifle before he remembered she was just dreaming. She'd settled again after a moment, curling tighter into herself beneath the quilt. He should have woken her, should have demanded answers, should have done a dozen things that would have been smarter than what he'd done, which was nothing. But Ella had been peaceful for the first time in days, and he hadn't wanted to disturb that fragile quiet. Now, with dawn arriving, he had to make decisions. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Through the window, he could see snow piled 3 feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into smooth drifts that looked almost beautiful in the pale light. The barn was still standing. He could see it through the skeletal branches of the cottonwood tree Catherine had planted their first year here, when they'd still been young and stupid enough to think they could make this land gentle. Ella stirred against his chest, making the small snuffling sounds that meant she'd wake soon and want breakfast. His back ached from sleeping upright, and his arms had gone numb hours ago, but he'd learned to ignore discomfort. That was the first lesson Wyoming taught, how to hurt and keep moving anyway. The woman by the fire opened her eyes. For a moment, she just stared at the ceiling, disoriented, like she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten here. Then her gaze shifted, found Jonas in the rocking chair watching her, and everything came flooding back. He saw it happen, the memory hitting her, her body tensing, her hands gripping the quilt like she expected him to rip it away. "You're awake," Jonas said quietly, so as not to disturb Ella. She sat up slowly, keeping the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. In the daylight, he could see more details, the tear in her dress at the hem, the bruise on her left cheekbone that had turned yellow-green with age, the way her eyes kept darting toward the door like she was calculating escape routes. "You brought me inside." Her voice was hoarse, rough from cold and disuse. "Seemed like you needed it. You could have left me." "Could have." "Why didn't you?" Jonas looked down at Ella, who was starting to wake, her small face scrunching up in that way that meant she was about to demand attention. "My wife wouldn't have forgiven me." "Your wife?" "She passed 3 months ago." Something shifted in the woman's expression. Not pity, exactly, but recognition, like she understood loss intimately. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He stood carefully, cradling Ella against his shoulder. "You got a name?" She hesitated, and he could see her weighing her options, deciding how much truth to offer. "Clara," she finally said. "Clara Wynne." "Jonas Mercer. This is Ella." Clara's eyes softened when she looked at the baby. "She's beautiful." "Takes after her mother." He moved toward the small kitchen area where he kept Ella's bottles and the goat's milk. "You hungry?" "I don't want to take your food." "Wasn't asking what you wanted. Asked if you were hungry." Another hesitation. "Yes." He nodded toward the table. "Sit. I'll make eggs. Got some bread from last week that's still good if you don't mind it a little hard." Clara stood slowly, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders, and moved to the table like she wasn't sure she was allowed. Jonas busied himself with breakfast, heating milk for Ella with one hand while cracking eggs into his battered iron skillet with the other. He'd gotten good at one-handed cooking these past months, gotten good at a lot of things he'd never thought he'd need to know. The eggs sizzled in bacon grease he'd saved from last week. The bread was hard, just like he'd warned, but he sliced it thick and set it on plates alongside the eggs. Simple food, frontier food, but honest, and more than Clara had probably eaten in days, judging by the way her hands trembled when she reached for the fork. "Eat slow," Jonas warned, sitting down across from her with Ella in the crook of his left arm, taking the bottle with desperate efficiency. "Your stomach's not ready for fast." Clara nodded and took small bites, but he could see the hunger in her eyes, the way she had to force herself not to devour everything at once. He ate his own breakfast mechanically, watching her between bites, trying to figure out what he'd brought into his home. She caught him staring. You want to know why I was out there? I want to know if whoever you're running from is going to show up at my door looking for you. No. She said it with certainty, then faltered. Probably not. Probably's not good enough. They think I died. She set down her fork, the eggs only half eaten. There was a fire. A cabin about 20 miles south of here. Everyone thinks I was in it. Were you? No, but my sister was. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and things unsaid. Jonas fed Ella the last of her bottle and moved her to his shoulder, patting her back gently until she burped. You gonna tell me the rest, or do I have to guess? Clara looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape, at the empty miles of white that stretched in every direction. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of someone who'd told this story too many times in their own head. My sister Sarah was 16, pretty girl, caught the eye of a man in town, Thomas Creed. He was older, mid-30s, worked as a foreman at one of the mines. She thought he loved her. I knew better. I tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen. Young girls never do. She paused, fingers tightening on the quilt. He got her pregnant. Then he got mean, started hitting her, telling her she'd trapped him, that he never wanted a baby. I tried to help her leave, but she was scared. He'd threatened to kill us both if she tried. Jonas didn't interrupt. He'd heard variations of this story before. Different names, different towns, but the same ugly core of violence and fear. One night, he beat her so bad she lost the baby. She was bleeding, and I couldn't stop it, and he wouldn't let me fetch the doctor. He said if anyone found out, he'd make sure we both disappeared. Sarah died in my arms while he stood there drinking whiskey like nothing was happening. Her voice cracked on the last word, the first real emotion breaking through. I pushed him, she continued. When she finally stopped breathing, when I knew she was gone, I pushed him. He'd been standing at the top of the stairs, drunk, and I pushed him. He fell, hit his head. I thought he was dead, but he started moving, cursing, saying he was going to kill me. So I ran, grabbed what I could, and ran. The next day I heard the cabin burn down. Someone said there were 2 bodies inside, Sarah's and mine. Thomas must have set the fire to cover up what happened. But he died in it himself. She looked at Jonas then, her eyes dry but haunted. So that's my story. I'm dead, according to everyone in Bitter Creek, and I need to stay that way. Jonas processed this, rocking Ella gently as she started to drift back to sleep. You kill anyone else? Or just him? I didn't kill him. The fire did. That's not an answer to my question. No, she said firmly. No one else. I'm not a killer, Mr. Mercer. I'm just someone who made a mistake that happened to work out in her favor. Some favor being dead. Better dead than what would have happened if I'd stayed. He couldn't argue with that. Out here, justice was rough and often wrong, especially for women. If folks thought she'd killed Thomas Creed, even in self-defense, she'd have faced a rope or worse. Running had probably saved her life, but it complicated his. Here's how this works, Jonas said, standing to settle Ella back in her cradle. She'd fallen asleep again, milk-drunk and content, looking so much like Catherine in these moments that it made his chest ache. You can stay until the road's clear. Week, maybe 2. You help around the place, cleaning, cooking, tending Ella when I'm working the ranch. I can't pay you, but you'll have food and shelter. When the weather breaks, you move on. Understood? Clara stood too, the quilt falling from her shoulders. In the daylight, she looked even more fragile than she had last night, like a strong wind could carry her away. But there was steel in her spine, pride in the set of her jaw. I can work, she said. I'm stronger than I look. You'd have to be. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. I need to check the barn, make sure the animals made it through the storm. There's a room off the kitchen, used to be storage. You can sleep there. Stove keeps it warm enough. Clothes in the trunk by the window are my wife's. Take what you need. He said it matter-of-factly, but it cost him more than he wanted to admit. Catherine's clothes, Catherine's room, Catherine's shawl still wrapped around this stranger's shoulders. Clara must have seen something in his face because she said quietly, "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen how much work needs doing around here." He stepped out into the cold morning, closing the door behind him before she could respond. The barn had survived the storm better than he'd hoped. Two of the shutters had torn loose, hanging by single hinges, and snow had drifted through the gaps in the upper loft, but the animals were alive and relatively calm. His 4 remaining milk cows, Bessie, Molly, Star, and the young heifer he hadn't named yet, stood in their stalls chewing hay with the patience of creatures who'd seen worse winters. The 2 draft horses, Thunder and Rain, Catherine had named them during a storm, finding it funny, nickered when he entered, hoping for grain. The chickens in their coop at the back were fine, huddled together for warmth, the rooster giving him the suspicious eye it gave everything that moved. Jonas went through the morning routine on autopilot, mucking stalls, spreading fresh hay, checking water troughs that had frozen overnight and needed to be broken up with the blunt end of an axe. His hands moved through familiar patterns while his mind churned through the problem of Clara Wynne. He told the truth about needing help. The ranch was too much for one man, especially one man with an infant to care for. Before Catherine's death, they'd managed it together, barely, and with more luck than planning, but they'd managed. Now he was drowning in work that never ended, watching the place slowly fall apart because he couldn't be everywhere at once. But bringing someone in, especially someone with Clara's kind of trouble following her, was risky. If word got out that he was harboring a woman from Bitter Creek, if Thomas Creed's friends or family came looking, Jonas shook his head, scattering the thoughts. He'd made his choice when he'd carried her inside. No use second-guessing it now. Thunder nudged his shoulder, looking for treats. Jonas fished an apple from his pocket, one of the last from the barrel in the root cellar, and split it between the 2 horses. "What do you think?" he asked the gelding. "Did I just make the stupidest mistake of my life?" Thunder crunched his apple contentedly and didn't offer an opinion. By the time Jonas finished in the barn and made his way back to the house, the sun had fully risen, turning the snow-covered landscape into something almost painfully beautiful. The kind of beautiful that could kill you if you weren't careful, that hid frozen death under a pristine white blanket. He stomped the snow off his boots on the porch and opened the door to find the house transformed. The fire had been built up properly, throwing real heat instead of the struggling warmth he usually managed. The floor had been swept. The dishes from breakfast were washed and drying on the rack. The smell of something cooking, soup maybe, from the last of the vegetables in the root cellar, filled the air. And Clara stood at the stove, wearing one of Catherine's old work dresses, the gray one she'd worn for heavy cleaning, with Ella balanced on her hip. The baby was awake and calm, studying Clara's face with the intense concentration infants brought to everything new. Clara turned when she heard him enter. "I hope this is all right. She woke up crying, and you were still in the barn, so It's fine." Jonas hung his coat on the hook, trying not to stare at how natural they looked together. This stranger in his wife's dress, holding his daughter like she belonged there. "How'd you know to heat the milk to that exact temperature?" "She's particular about it." "All babies are particular about something. You just have to pay attention." Clara bounced Ella gently. "She's a sweet thing. Barely fussed at all once I figured out what she wanted." Jonas moved to the basin to wash his hands, the cold water biting at his skin. He could feel Clara watching him, waiting for something, approval maybe, or permission to keep existing in this space. "The soup smells good," he offered. "It's just vegetables and some of that salt pork I found. Nothing fancy." "Fancy's not what we do here." She smiled at that, just a small curve of her lips, but it changed her whole face. For a moment, she didn't look haunted or desperate or afraid. She just looked young. The next few hours fell into an unexpected rhythm. Jonas worked on repairing the barn shutters, fighting with frozen hinges and wood that had swollen with moisture. Clara kept the house running, tending Ella, feeding the chickens, even venturing out to the root cellar for more vegetables despite the cold. She moved through the work with the efficiency of someone who'd learned hard labor young, who understood that survival meant doing what needed doing without complaint. By afternoon, when Jonas came in for the midday meal, he found her sitting by the fire with Ella asleep in her arms, humming something low and wordless. She stopped when she saw him, looking almost guilty. "She wouldn't settle in the cradle," Clara explained. "So I thought—" "It's fine," Jonas interrupted. "She likes being held. I just can't always do it." They ate in companionable silence, the soup, which was better than he'd expected, and more of the hard bread. Outside, the sun was already starting its descent, the winter days cruelly short. Jonas found himself calculating how much firewood they'd need to make it through another night, how many supplies he had left, how long before he'd have to risk the trip to town. "You're thinking about money," Clara said suddenly. He looked up, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "You get a certain look. Men always do when they're thinking about money, or lack of it." "You always so observant?" "You learn to read people when your survival depends on it." "Fair point." Jonas set down his spoon. "I need to make a run to town soon. Redemption's about 12 miles southwest. There's a general store, a feed supply, and a doctor if Ella needs anything. But with the snow this deep, it might be another week before the roads are passable. Can you afford to wait that long?" "Can I afford not to?" He rubbed his face, exhaustion seeping back in now that he'd stopped moving. "I owe money at the feed store. I owe money for Catherine's medicine that didn't work. I owe money on next season's seed. And I'm down to maybe 3 weeks of supplies if we're careful." Clara shifted Ella in her arms, the baby stirring but not waking. "I could help with that." "You got money I don't know about?" "No, but I can work, really work. I grew up on a farm outside Bitter Creek. I know animals, crops, repairs. I'm not asking for wages, just—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Just let me earn my keep properly. Not just housework, real ranch work." Jonas studied her, this thin woman who looked like she'd blow away in a strong wind, claiming she could handle the brutal labor of a working ranch. "It's harder than you think, dangerous too. I can't be watching out for you while I'm trying to keep this place running. I'm not asking you to watch out for me. I'm asking you to let me work." There was a challenge in her voice, a determination that reminded him uncomfortably of Catherine. His wife had been the same way, refused to be coddled, insisted on pulling her weight even when pregnant, even when the work was too hard, even when it hurt. It had been one of the things he'd loved about her, and one of the things that had scared him most. "All right," he said finally. "But we start small. Chicken coop needs cleaning, fences need checking. Think you can handle that?" "Yes." "And if you can't, if it's too much, you tell me. I don't need another person dying on me. Understood?" Something flickered in her eyes, pain maybe, or understanding. "Understood." That night, after the evening chores were done and Ella had been fed and changed and rocked to sleep, Jonas found a pair of his old boots by the door. They'd been patched and cleaned, the worst of the damage repaired with leather strips that Clara must have found somewhere in his disaster of a storage area. He picked them up, turning them over in his hands. The repairs were neat, professional almost, better than he could have done. "My father was a cobbler," Clara said from her doorway, the small room off the kitchen that she'd claimed as her own. "Before he died, he taught me how to work leather." Jonas set the boots down carefully. "These are good." "They needed doing. You can't work in broken boots." They stood there in the firelight, the house quiet except for Ella's soft breathing from the cradle and the ever-present whisper of wind outside. Two strangers bound by circumstance and necessity, trying to figure out how to exist in the same space without damage. "My wife used to say that a house runs on small kindnesses," Jonas said quietly. "The little things people do for each other without being asked." "Your wife sounds like she was a good woman." "The best." He picked up the boots again, weighing them in his hands. "These are a small kindness, Clara Wynne." "So was opening your door at midnight." He couldn't argue with that. That night, for the first time since Catherine's death, Jonas slept in his own bed instead of the rocking chair. He lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the fire crackling down to embers, and the new sound, someone else breathing in the room off the kitchen, another life under his roof that he was now responsible for. He should have been anxious, should have been second-guessing every decision that had led him here, but instead he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, not yet, but maybe the absence of hopelessness, which was close enough. Outside, the wind had finally stopped howling. The storm had passed, and somewhere in the darkness, the Holloway Ranch continued its stubborn existence. Two broken people and one innocent baby determined to make it through another winter night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow would test Clara's claims about being able to work. Tomorrow would decide whether this fragile arrangement could actually survive. But tonight, the house was warm. Ella was peaceful, and Jonas Mercer found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd made the right choice after all, even if neither of them could see where that choice would lead them. The first test came 3 days later, just after dawn broke cold and clear over the Holloway Ranch. Jonas had been up since before first light, feeding the animals and checking the water troughs that seemed determined to freeze solid no matter how many times he broke the ice. He came back to the house expecting to find Clara inside with Ella, maybe starting breakfast, continuing the pattern they'd fallen into over the past few days. Instead, he found her in the chicken coop, mucking out soiled straw with the kind of methodical determination that spoke of muscle memory. She'd wrapped herself in an old coat of his, 3 sizes too big, sleeves rolled up to keep them out of the muck, and her dark hair was tied back with a strip of cloth. The chickens clucked around her feet, unconcerned by the intrusion, and she worked without pause even when she must have heard him approach. "Thought I told you I'd handle the coop today," Jonas said from the doorway. Clara didn't look up, just kept scooping soiled straw into the wheelbarrow she'd somehow dragged across the snow-packed yard. "You've got your hands full with the cattle. This needed doing." "Ella is asleep in her cradle by the fire. I checked on her 5 minutes ago. She's fine." Jonas watched her work for a moment, noting the efficiency of her movements, the way she didn't waste motion or energy. She'd been telling the truth about knowing farm work. This wasn't the fumbling of someone learning as they went. This was practiced skill. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally. "Yes, I did." She straightened then, meeting his eyes directly. "You gave me shelter. You fed me. You trusted me with your daughter. I'm not the kind of person who takes without giving back, Mr. Mercer." "Jonas," he corrected, "if you're going to be mucking out my chicken coop at dawn, you might as well use my Christian name." Something softened in her expression. "Jonas, then, and I meant what I said before, I can work." "I'm starting to believe you." Over the following days, they settled into a rhythm that felt less like accommodation and more like partnership. Clara took over the house entirely, cooking, cleaning, tending Ella with a natural ease that made Jonas's chest ache with memories of Catherine. But she also ventured outside whenever Ella slept, tackling the endless list of repairs and maintenance that Jonas had been putting off for months. She fixed the broken hinge on the barn door, using wire and ingenuity when proper materials weren't available. She organized the chaotic mess of his storage area, creating actual systems where before there had been only controlled disaster. She even climbed onto the porch roof one afternoon to replace shingles that had blown loose in the storm, ignoring Jonas's protests about the danger. "I'm lighter than you," she'd called down. "Makes more sense for me to do it." "Makes more sense for nobody to do it until spring," he'd shouted back. "And let the water damage get worse? That's wasteful." She'd been right, of course. The shingles had needed replacing, and she'd done a better job than he would have, her smaller hands able to work in tighter spaces. But watching her up there, balanced on ice-slicked wood 3 stories above frozen ground, had made something twist in his gut that he didn't want to examine too closely. By the end of the first week, Jonas had to admit that Clara Wynne was the best thing that had happened to the Holloway Ranch since Catherine had convinced him to buy the milk cows instead of more beef cattle. But it was the small things that surprised him most. The way she hummed while she worked, old songs he half remembered from childhood that filled the house with something besides silence and grief. The way she'd found Catherine's sewing basket and spent her evenings mending his clothes, patching tears he'd learned to live with because he had no time or skill to fix them himself. The way she talked to Ella, not baby talk, but real conversation, telling her about the chickens and the weather and the way snow looked in morning light, like the baby could understand every word. And maybe Ella could, in her way, because she smiled more now, cried less, slept better. Jonas tried not to think about what that meant, about how easily his daughter had accepted this stranger into their lives, about how natural it felt to come in from the cold and find Clara waiting by the fire with Ella on her hip and dinner warming on the stove. He tried not to think about it and failed constantly. The second week brought visitors. Jonas was in the barn replacing rotted boards in the hayloft when he heard horses approaching. 2 of them, from the sound, moving at a steady walk through the snow. He climbed down the ladder quickly, grabbing his rifle out of habit, and stepped outside to see Samuel Pritchett and his eldest son William riding up the path toward the house. Samuel was nearly 70, weathered and bent by decades of frontier living, but still sharp-eyed and stronger than he looked. William was maybe 20, broad-shouldered and quiet, with his father's practical nature and his late mother's gentle disposition. Good people, both of them, and the closest thing Jonas had to friends out here. "Jonas!" Samuel called, raising a hand in greeting. "Saw your smoke yesterday. Thought we'd better check you made it through that storm all right." "Made it fine," Jonas replied, very aware of Clara inside the house, very aware of how this would look to his neighbors. "Lost some shingles, but nothing major." "Good, good." Samuel dismounted with the stiffness of old joints, and William followed suit. "Thought you might need—" The door opened and Clara stepped onto the porch with Ella in her arms. She'd been expecting Jonas back for the midday meal, probably wondering what was taking him so long. She froze when she saw the visitors, her whole body going tense with the instinct of someone who'd learned to fear strangers. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "Well," Samuel said finally, his bushy eyebrows climbing toward his hairline, "seems like you've had company." Jonas moved toward the porch, positioning himself between Clara and the visitors without quite making it obvious. "Samuel Pritchett, William Pritchett. This is Clara Wynne. She's helping around the place for a spell." "Helping?" Samuel repeated the word like he was testing its weight. His eyes moved from Clara to Jonas and back again, and Jonas could practically see the old man's mind working through implications and possibilities. "That's right," Jonas said firmly. "Storm caught her on the road. She needed shelter. I needed help with the ranch. Seemed like good sense all around." William had the grace to look embarrassed by his father's scrutiny, but Samuel kept staring at Clara with the frank appraisal of someone who'd spent too long on the frontier to waste time on polite pretense. "Ma'am," Samuel said finally, tipping his hat. "Must have been some storm to drive you this far north. Where you headed originally?" "North," Clara answered, her voice steady despite the way her hands tightened on Ella. "Just north." "From?" "Samuel," Jonas interrupted, his tone carrying a warning. "She's a guest on my property. That makes her business my business, not yours." The old man's eyes shifted back to Jonas, and something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or a challenge. Samuel had known Jonas since he was a boy, had helped his father build this ranch, had stood beside Jonas at Catherine's funeral and offered words that meant more than any preacher's platitudes. "All right," Samuel said slowly. "Your property, your business. But Jonas, you know how folks talk. Woman shows up out of nowhere, staying in a house with a widower and his baby daughter. I don't give a damn how folks talk." "Maybe you should." Samuel's voice had gone harder now, protective in the way of someone who'd watched Jonas grow up. "Catherine's barely cold in the ground, and you've got another woman wearing her clothes, sleeping under your roof." "In the storage room," Clara said suddenly. Both men turned to look at her. "I sleep in the storage room off the kitchen. Mr. Mercer sleeps in his own bed. And Mrs. Mercer isn't cold in the ground. She's in her daughter's smile, and in the way her husband keeps this ranch running because that's what she would have wanted. Don't you dare suggest otherwise." Her voice shook with anger, and Ella startled against her, beginning to fuss. Clara bounced her gently, murmuring soothing sounds, while continuing to stare down Samuel Pritchett with the kind of fierce pride that reminded Jonas uncomfortably of cornered animals. William let out a low whistle. "She's got spirit. I'll give her that." "Spirit's not the question," Samuel said, but some of the accusation had left his voice. He looked at Clara differently now, seeing past the stranger to something else. "Question is whether Jonas knows what he's doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Jonas said. "I'm surviving. Same as you, same as everyone out here. Clara's making that easier, not harder. That's all you need to know." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Jonas with his defensive posture, Clara with her chin raised in defiance, Ella now calm again between them. Finally, the old man nodded. "Fair enough. Your ranch, your choice." He turned to William. "Get the supplies from the saddlebags." "Supplies?" Jonas asked. "Brought you some extra feed, couple pounds of flour, and some of that medicine the doctor said helps with baby colic. Figured you might be running low after being snowed in." Samuel's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Whether I agree with your choices or not, Jonas, I'm not going to let you starve. Your daddy would haunt me." Jonas felt something loosen in his chest. Thank you, Samuel. I'll pay you back. You'll do no such thing. Consider it a gift for Ella. Samuel moved toward his horse, then paused. But Jonas, be careful. Whatever this is, whatever you've got going here, it's going to draw attention, and not all of it will be friendly as mine. They left shortly after, William shooting apologetic glances back at the house while Samuel rode straight-backed and silent. Jonas stood in the yard watching them go, very aware of Clara still on the porch behind him, very aware that something had just shifted. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. "I shouldn't have spoken to your friend that way. He's not my friend. He's my neighbor. There's a difference. Still, he was just looking out for you." Jonas turned to face her. The afternoon sun caught her hair, making it shine nearly black, and Ella had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the trusting weight of complete security. They looked right together. They looked like they belonged. That was the problem. "He's right, you know," Jonas said. "People will talk. Hell, they're probably already talking. Widow takes in mysterious woman, starts playing house. It's exactly the kind of story that spreads through places like Redemption like wildfire." "You want me to leave?" It wasn't a question. "No." The word came out faster than he intended. "No, I need you to understand what you're walking into, what we're both walking into. This isn't just about shelter and work anymore. This is about reputation and judgment and all the ugly ways people make assumptions." Clara adjusted Ella's weight, her expression unreadable. "I've dealt with ugly assumptions before, Jonas. I can handle it." "Maybe you can. But can Ella? She's the one who'll grow up hearing whispers about her father and the woman who what?" Clara's voice had an edge now. "Who saved this ranch from falling apart? Who kept your daughter fed and warm while you worked yourself half to death? Who—" She stopped, taking a breath. "I'm sorry, that's not fair." "It's true, though. Truth doesn't always matter. You know that as well as I do." They stood there in the cold, the space between them filled with complications neither of them wanted to name. Finally, Jonas sighed. "Come on, let's get those supplies inside before they freeze. And Clara, thank you for what you said about Catherine. She would have liked that." Something in Clara's expression softened. She must have been extraordinary to inspire that kind of loyalty. She was. Jonas moved toward the saddlebags William had left by the porch steps. She really was. That evening, after Ella had been fed and settled for the night, Jonas sat by the fire working on the ranch's accounts. A depressing exercise that consisted mainly of watching numbers refuse to add up the way he needed them to. The supplies from Samuel would help, but they didn't solve the fundamental problem. He was broke, getting broker, and winter still had months left to run. Clara emerged from her room with a bundle of something in her arms. "I found these in the trunk, some of Catherine's dresses that were too worn for regular use. I thought maybe I could remake them into clothes for Ella. She's growing so fast and—" "You don't have to ask permission," Jonas interrupted. "Use whatever you need. They were your wife's things. And now they're just things. Catherine would rather see them used than sitting in a trunk gathering dust." He set down his pencil, rubbing his eyes. "Everything in this house is here to be useful, Clara, including you, apparently." She smiled at that, settling into the other chair by the fire with the fabric spread across her lap. For a while they worked in comfortable silence. Jonas with his impossible numbers, Clara with her needle and thread, the fire crackling between them. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said eventually. "Depends on the question." "Why did you really let me stay?" The truth, not the polite answer. Jonas considered lying, considered deflecting, considered any response that wasn't the raw honesty that wanted to spill out. But there was something about the firelight, about the late hour, about the way Clara kept her eyes on her sewing instead of him, that made truth easier. "Because I'm drowning," he said quietly. "Because every day feels like I'm barely keeping my head above water, and some days I'm not sure why I'm even bothering. Because when you showed up, desperate and freezing and offering to work, it felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't going to have to do this alone anymore." Claire's hand stilled on the fabric. "That's a lot of weight to put on a stranger." "I know, that's why I didn't want to say it." "Jonas," She looked at him then, her dark eyes reflecting firelight. I'm not here to save you. I can't save anyone. I couldn't even save my own sister. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm just asking you to stay, help, be present. That's all. For how long? It was the question he'd been avoiding since that first night. The arrangement had been temporary, a week or two until the roads cleared. But the roads had cleared 3 days ago, and neither of them had mentioned her leaving. Neither of them had wanted to. I don't know, Jonas admitted. Long as you want, I suppose. Long as it makes sense. And if people talk, let them talk. We know the truth. That's what matters. Claire went back to her sewing, but Jonas could see the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Your wife really did teach you well. Teach me what? How to be kind in a hard place. The words settled between them like snow, soft and accumulating, and Jonas found himself thinking about Catherine, about the woman who'd made this house a home, who'd insisted that kindness wasn't weakness, but the hardest kind of strength. She'd believed that even here, especially here, in this unforgiving territory where the land tried to break you daily, you had to hold on to your humanity with both hands. She tried, Jonas said. I don't always succeed. Nobody always succeeds, but you're trying. That counts. They fell back into silence, but it felt different now, warmer, somehow, like something unspoken had been acknowledged and accepted. Outside, the wind had picked up again, not the howling fury of that first storm, but the constant presence Jonas had lived with his whole life. Inside, the fire burned steady, and two people who'd been strangers a week ago sat together in the peace of shared understanding. The third week brought the trip to redemption that Jonas could no longer postpone. The feed supply was critical, and he needed to check on credit extensions at the general store, and there were other necessities that couldn't wait. He'd put it off as long as possible, dreading the questions and stares that Clara's presence would inevitably provoke. I'm going with you, Clara announced at breakfast, in a tone that suggested she wouldn't accept argument. Jonas had been expecting this. That's not a good idea. Why not? Because every gossip in redemption will see you and immediately start inventing stories about who you are and what you're doing here. They're going to do that anyway. At least this way I can face it head on instead of hiding like I have something to be ashamed of. Clara, I'm not a secret, Jonas. Her voice was firm but not angry. I'm not something you need to hide away. And besides, someone needs to watch Ella while you're conducting business, unless you think carrying a baby through the feed store is professional. She had a point. Jonas had been dreading trying to negotiate with merchants while juggling an infant who seemed to save her worst tantrums for the most inconvenient moments. Fine, he conceded, but we're keeping this simple. In and out, no unnecessary conversation. As you wish. The ride to redemption took 3 hours through snow-packed roads, Jonas driving the wagon, while Clara sat beside him with Ella bundled in blankets. The baby loved the motion, gurgling happily at the passing landscape, and Clara kept up a steady stream of narration about the scenery that made Jonas smile despite his anxiety. Look, Ella, see that tree? That's a cottonwood. Your mother planted one just like it at the ranch. And those tracks in the snow? Those are from a rabbit, maybe a family of rabbits, living warm under the ground. As they crested the final hill, redemption spread out below them. A small collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, smoke rising from chimneys, a church steeple pointing toward gray winter sky. Population maybe 200 if you counted the outlying farms. Not much, but more civilization than Jonas typically wanted. They pulled up outside the general store first. Jonas helped Clara down from the wagon, very aware of the faces already turning toward them from doorways and windows. Word would spread fast. Inside, the store was warm and cluttered, every available surface covered with goods that ranged from practical to bizarre. The owner, Harold Chen, looked up from behind the counter with the expression of a man who'd just been handed unexpected entertainment. Jonas Mercer, Harold said, his English carrying the slight accent of someone who'd learned it as a second language. Haven't seen you since the funeral, and you've brought company. This is Clara. She's helping at the ranch. Clara, this is Harold Chen. He runs the best general store in 3 counties. The only general store in 3 counties, Harold corrected, but he smiled as he said it. He was maybe 50, sharp-eyed and shrewd, and he'd built his business on the principle that everyone's money spent the same regardless of where they came from. Jonas liked him. "Welcome, Miss Clara. What can I do for you folks today?" They went through the list: flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, all the necessities that kept a household running. Harold tallied everything up with quick, practiced movements, his abacus clicking steadily. "That comes to $18, he announced. "But Jonas, we need to talk about your account." Jonas had been dreading this. "I know I'm behind, but I'll have money after spring calving. I just need—" "You need an extension. I know." Harold leaned on the counter, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Jonas, I like you. Your father was good to me when I first came west, didn't treat me different like some folks did, so I want to help. But I've got my own bills to pay, my own family to feed. I can give you another month, but after that you need your money." "I understand." Clara, who'd been browsing the fabric section with Ella, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Chen, do you buy handwork, embroidery, sewing, that sort of thing?" Harold looked surprised. "Sometimes. Why?" "Because I'm very good with a needle, and if there's a market for it, I could provide quality work. Help offset what Jonas owes." "Claire, you don't have to—" Jonas started. "I want to." She met his eyes directly. "Let me help properly, not just around the ranch, but with this too." Harold looked between them, something calculating in his expression. "Tell you what, make me 3 good pieces. Table runners maybe, or decorative pillowcases, and I'll see if I can sell them. If they move, we'll talk about regular work." "Deal," Clara said immediately. They finished their shopping and moved on to the feed store, where Jonas negotiated another grudging extension while Clara waited outside with Ella. Then there were stops at the smithy, the leather shop, and finally, because Jonas needed to make an appearance, the small church where Reverend Thomas presided over both the living and dead of redemption. The Reverend was in his 50s, gray-haired and kindly, with the sort of gentle authority that made people confess sins they'd planned to keep secret. He greeted Jonas warmly, blessed Ella with a practiced hand, and then turned his attention to Clara. "I don't believe we've met, my dear." "Clara Wynne, Reverend. I'm staying at the Holloway Ranch, helping Mr. Mercer with his daughter and the property." "I see." The Reverend's eyes were kind but knowing. "And where do you hail from, Miss Wynne?" Jonas saw Clara's shoulders tense infinitesimally. "South, small town, nothing worth mentioning." "Every town is worth mentioning, my dear. Every soul has a story worth telling." "Maybe so, Reverend, but some stories are better left in the past." It was the wrong thing to say, too defensive, too mysterious. Jonas could see the Reverend's interest sharpen, could practically watch the man's pastoral instincts kick in. Nothing drew a preacher's attention like a woman with secrets and a soul that needed saving. "Well," Reverend Thomas said slowly, "you're welcome at our services, Miss Wynne. Sundays at 10. We're a small congregation, but we believe in welcoming strangers." "I appreciate that." They left shortly after, Jonas eager to escape before more questions could be asked. But as they climbed back into the wagon, he caught sight of several women clustered outside the church, heads together, eyes tracking Clara's every movement. The gossip had begun. The ride home was quieter. Clara seemed lost in thought. Ella had fallen asleep, and Jonas found himself replaying every interaction, every word, wondering what stories were already being invented about them. "That wasn't so bad," Clara finally said. "Are you kidding? That was a disaster." "How so?" "Everyone we met looked at us like we were performing some kind of scandal. The Reverend practically accused you of being a woman of questionable virtue." "He did no such thing. He was curious, that's all." "Curious is just polite talk for suspicious." Clara shifted Ella's weight in her arms. "Jonas, people are always going to be suspicious. That's human nature. But we didn't do anything wrong. We're not doing anything wrong, so let them think what they want." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to live here permanently. Neither are you, technically. You could sell the ranch, move somewhere else, start over." Jonas's hands tightened on the reins. "This ranch is my family's legacy. My grandfather built it. My father expanded it. Catherine and I were going to pass it to Ella someday. I'm not walking away from that." "Then you're going to have to accept that people will talk. That's the price of staying." And what's your price, Clara? What do you get out of staying at a failing ranch with a widower and his baby? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, I get to not be dead. I get to not be running. I get to wake up every morning and know that today at least I'm safe. That's worth more than you realize. Her voice carried such weight, such bone-deep exhaustion, that Jonas felt ashamed for asking. She was right. He had no idea what she'd been through, what it meant to live knowing everyone thought you were dead, that going back meant facing consequences worse than running forever. I'm sorry, he said quietly. That wasn't fair. Neither was your question, but I answered it anyway. They made the rest of the journey in silence, arriving back at the ranch just as sunset was painting the snow orange and gold. Jonas unhitched the horses while Clara took Ella inside, and by the time he finished settling the animals for the night, he could smell dinner cooking. That had become their routine, Jonas handling the livestock, Clara handling the house, both of them moving through their separate tasks with the ease of long practice. It shouldn't have felt so natural after only a few weeks. It shouldn't have felt like they'd been doing this for years. But it did. That night, after Ella was asleep and the house was quiet, Jonas found Clara sitting at the table with fabric spread out before her, already working on the pieces she'd promised Harold Chen. Her needle moved with quick, precise strokes, creating delicate patterns that seemed too beautiful for the rough frontier life they led. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Jonas asked, settling into his chair with the account books. "My mother. She did fancy work for wealthy families back east before she married my father and moved west. She said beauty didn't have to be practical to be worthwhile." "Your father disagreed?" "My father thought anything that didn't keep you fed or warm was wasteful. He and my mother fought about it constantly." Clara's needle never stopped moving. "She kept doing it anyway, though, in secret sometimes after he'd gone to bed. She said it was how she remembered who she was before this place tried to make her into someone else." "Did it work?" "For a while. Then she died giving birth to Sarah, and my father burned all her embroidery work. Said it was vanity, that God had punished her for putting beauty above duty." Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jonas could hear the old hurt beneath it. "I saved one piece, a handkerchief she'd made with our names stitched in the corner. I kept it hidden for years. Lost it when I ran from Bitter Creek." Jonas set down his pencil. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's just thread and cloth. The important part, what she taught me, the skill itself that I still have, that can't be burned or lost." She finished a particularly complex stitch and held up the fabric to examine it in the lamplight. Even unfinished, it was beautiful, tiny flowers and vines interweaving in patterns that seemed to dance. "Harold's going to sell these," Jonas said with certainty, "probably for more than he's expecting." "I hope so. I want to help, Jonas, really help, not just with chores, but with keeping this place running." "You're already helping more than you know." She smiled at that, and something passed between them in the firelight. Not romance exactly, but recognition. Two people who'd been broken by life, finding unexpected resilience in each other's presence. Two people learning that survival sometimes meant accepting help you didn't think you deserved. Outside, the wind whispered around the corners of the house, and the Wyoming night settled deep and cold across the land. Inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, Jonas Mercer and Clara Wynne sat together in companionable silence, building something neither of them could name yet, but both of them needed desperately. It wasn't what either of them had planned. It wasn't what Catherine would have wanted, or what Clara's sister had died hoping for. But it was real, and it was theirs. And in that moment, that was enough. The fourth week began with rumors that reached the ranch before Jonas even got to town. Samuel Pritchett rode up on a Thursday morning, his face grim, and Jonas knew immediately that something had shifted. "There's talk," Samuel said without preamble, refusing Jonas's offer of coffee. "About your house guest." Jonas felt Clara stiffen behind him where she stood in the doorway. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that says she might not be who she claims. Someone passing through from Bitter Creek mentioned a woman named Clara Wynne who disappeared after a man died suspicious. They're saying she might be a killer." The word hung in the cold air like a knife. "That's ridiculous," Jonas said firmly. "She's been nothing but helpful here. Good with Ella, good with the work." "I'm not saying I believe it," Samuel interrupted. "I'm saying other folks might. And if they do, if they start thinking you're harboring a fugitive or worse, that's going to bring trouble down on all of us. Clara stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the way her hands shook. Mr. Pritchett, I won't let Jonas suffer for helping me. If people are talking, if there's going to be trouble, I'll leave. Today, if necessary. No, Jonas said immediately. You're not going anywhere. Jonas, I mean it, Clara. You stay. We'll deal with whatever comes. Samuel looked between them, something knowing in his weathered face. You're playing a dangerous game here, boy, for both of you. Maybe, but it's my game to play. The old man sighed, settling deeper into his saddle. Your father would have done the same damn thing. Stubborn runs in your blood. He turned his horse. Just be careful, Jonas. The frontier's got no mercy for fools, and even less for those who try to protect them. He rode away, leaving Jonas and Clara standing in the yard as morning sunlight turned the snow to blinding white. Ella's cry came from inside. She'd woken early, sensing the tension, and Clara turned to go to her without another word. But Jonas caught her arm gently. We're not done talking about this. What's there to talk about? Samuel's right. I'm bringing trouble to your door, and I need to leave before... Before what? Before people decide to judge you without knowing the truth? Before they destroy you for surviving something that wasn't your fault? His voice was harder than he intended. I lost Catherine to fever because I couldn't save her. I'll be damned if I lose someone else just because other people can't mind their own business. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. This isn't the same thing, isn't it? You're both women who deserve better than what life gave them. The only difference is I can still help you. Ella's cries grew more insistent, and Clara pulled away gently to go inside. Jonas stood alone in the yard, watching sunlight glitter off snow, wondering when exactly Clara Wynne had stopped being a stranger and started being someone he'd fight for. The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Probably that first night, when she'd turned away into the storm, and he'd been unable to let her go. Some choices, Jonas was learning, were made in moments but lived with forever. The question was whether he'd regret this one or spend the rest of his life grateful he'd been brave enough to make it. As the sun climbed higher and the ranch waited for whatever came next, Jonas Mercer realized he already knew the answer. The answer came sooner than Jonas expected, riding in on a cold Saturday afternoon in the form of 3 men he'd never seen before. Jonas was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard the horses, too many of them, moving too deliberately to be friendly visitors. He set down the axe and walked around the building to find 3 riders stopped in his yard, their breath and their horses' breath making clouds in the frozen air. Hard men, all of them, with the look of people who'd learned violence young and never forgotten the lessons. The one in front was maybe 40, with a scar running from his left eye to his jawline and a revolver worn low on his hip like he knew how to use it. The other 2 were younger, rougher, with the kind of hungry eyes that made Jonas's hand drift toward the rifle he'd left leaning against the barn wall. "Help you, gentlemen?" Jonas called, keeping his voice level, his body language neutral. Catherine had taught him that. Never show fear to predators, never give them the satisfaction of knowing they've rattled you. "Looking for someone," the scarred man said. His voice was surprisingly cultured, Eastern educated, which somehow made him more dangerous. "Woman named Clara Wynne. Heard she might be staying here." Jonas felt ice slide down his spine. "Don't know anyone by that name." "No?" The man smiled, and it was the worst smile Jonas had ever seen, all teeth and no warmth. "That's interesting because we heard very specific things. That you took in a woman, dark-haired, early 20s, showed up out of nowhere a few weeks back. That sound like anyone to you?" "Sounds like half the drifters in Wyoming territory." "Maybe so, but this particular drifter, she's wanted for murder back in Bitter Creek. Thomas Creed's murder, to be specific. And Mr. Creed's brother, that would be me, Jacob Creed, he's very interested in finding her." The door to the house opened, and Clara stepped onto the porch with Ella in her arms. Jonas wanted to shout at her to go back inside, to hide, to run, but it was too late. Jacob Creed's eyes locked onto her like a wolf spotting wounded prey. "Well," Jacob said softly, "there she is. Clara Wynne, back from the dead." Clara's face had gone white, but her voice stayed steady. "I didn't kill your brother, Mr. Creed." "No? Then why'd you run?" Why'd you let everyone think you died in that fire? Because I knew no one would believe the truth. And what truth would that be? Jacob dismounted slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun. The other two men followed suit, spreading out to flank him. That my brother, a respected man, a foreman with responsibilities, beat some girl to death and you were just an innocent bystander? She was my sister, and he did beat her to death. He killed her and their unborn baby, and when I tried to stop him, he came after me. I pushed him to defend myself. That's the truth. That's your truth. Here's mine. You killed my brother, burned down his cabin, and ran like the guilty thing you are. And now I'm going to make sure you answer for it. Jonas moved forward, putting himself between Jacob and the porch. This is my property, Creed. You've got no authority here. Don't need authority. Just need justice. Justice? You want to talk about justice? Clara's voice rose, anger finally breaking through her careful control. Your brother murdered my sister. He beat her until she lost the baby she wanted desperately, until she bled out in my arms while he drank whiskey and laughed. Where was justice for her? You've got no proof of that. I've got the truth. That's all the proof I need. Jacob's hand tightened on his gun. The law says different. The law says you're a killer who needs to hang. There is no law in Bitter Creek, Clara shot back. There's just men like your brother and men like you who think power gives you the right to do whatever you want to people who can't fight back. Careful, girl. You're already in enough trouble without adding insults. Jonas's rifle was still leaning against the barn wall 20 feet away. Too far. The revolver in his belt was loaded, but going for it would start a fight he couldn't win. Not 3 against 1, not with Clara and Ella exposed on the porch behind him. He needed to think. Needed to find an angle that didn't end with people dead. Let's say you're right, Jonas said, forcing his voice to stay calm. Let's say Clara killed your brother. You planning to just shoot her here? In front of witnesses? In front of a baby? I'm planning to take her back to Bitter Creek for trial. There's no trial in Bitter Creek. You'll hang her from the first tree you find. Jacob shrugged. Maybe, but that's her problem, not yours, unless you're planning to make it yours. The threat was explicit now, hanging in the air like smoke. Jonas could let them take Clara, could stand aside, protect himself and Ella, choose survival over principle. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice his father would have made without hesitation. But it wasn't the choice Catherine would have made, and it wasn't the choice Jonas could live with. She's under my protection, he heard himself say. That makes it my problem. Jonas, don't... Clara started, but he cut her off. She works for me. Lives under my roof. That means anyone who wants to hurt her goes through me first. That's frontier law, Creed. You know it, same as I do. Jacob studied him for a long moment, reassessing. The 2 men flanking him shifted nervously, hands drifting toward their weapons. You really want to die for a woman you barely know? A killer who'll probably slit your throat in your sleep? I want to do what's right. And what's right is giving her a fair hearing, not handing her over to a lynch mob dressed up as justice. There's no fair hearing out here. There's just survival and consequences. Then I choose consequences. Jacob's smile returned, colder than before. Brave words. Let's see if you still believe them when we come back with the sheriff. Redemption's sheriff won't touch her without evidence, and you don't have any. Don't I? I've got her own admission that she pushed my brother. I've got witnesses who'll testify she ran. I've got a dead man and a burned cabin. Jacob swung back into his saddle. That's more than enough to convince a jury, assuming she lives long enough to see one. He wheeled his horse around, the other 2 following suit. This isn't over, Mercer. We'll be back. And when we come, you'd better have made your peace with whatever God you believe in. They rode off, kicking up snow and leaving deep tracks in the yard. Jonas stood watching until they disappeared over the ridge, then sagged against the barn wall, his legs suddenly unsteady. Clara was beside him in moments, still clutching Ella. Jonas, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have... What? Protected you? Stood up for what's right? Made yourself a target. Her voice was raw with fear. He's going to come back, Jonas. Him or men like him, and they're going to... Let them come. I meant what I said. You're under my protection. Why? The word came out as almost a sob. Why would you risk everything for me? Your life, Your daughter's safety, this ranch. Why would you throw it all away? Jonas looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the fear and desperation to the woman underneath. The woman who'd survived horrors he couldn't imagine, who'd walked through a killing storm rather than take charity, who'd worked herself to exhaustion to earn her keep. The woman who sang to his daughter and mended his clothes and filled his house with something besides grief. Because you knocked, he said quietly, and I opened. And maybe that sounds stupid, maybe it sounds naive, but Catherine believed that sometimes the right choice is the hard choice, that sometimes you have to stand for something even when it costs you everything. And if it costs you Ella? If they come back and they won't, I won't let them. He straightened, squaring his shoulders. But Clara, I need you to tell me the absolute truth now. Everything. No holding back, no protecting me from the ugly parts. I need to know exactly what we're facing. She nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. All right. I'll tell you everything. They went inside, and while Ella played in her cradle, Clara told her story. The real story. Not the sanitized version she'd given before. She told him about Thomas Creed's slow transformation from charming suitor to violent abuser, about Sarah's growing terror, her desperate attempts to please him, her belief that if she just tried harder, loved him better, he'd become the man she thought she'd fallen in love with. She told him about the night Sarah lost the baby, the blood, the screaming, the way Thomas had stood over them both with dead eyes and said it was probably for the best anyway, that he'd never wanted the burden of a child. Sarah died begging him to get help, Clara said, her voice breaking. She died believing it was somehow her fault, that she'd failed him, and he just kept drinking, like she was nothing, like she'd never mattered at all. Jonas's hands clenched into fists. He'd seen evil before, the casual cruelty of men who viewed women as property, who believed strength gave them the right to dominate. But hearing Clara describe it, seeing the pain in her eyes, made him want to ride after Jacob Creed and finish what his brother had started. I didn't plan to push him, Clara continued. I wasn't thinking about murder or revenge. I couldn't let him stand there anymore. Couldn't let him drink and laugh while Sarah's body was still warm. So I pushed him, and he fell. And I heard something crack, his head hitting the stairs, I think. He started cursing, trying to get up. And I ran. Just grabbed what I could and ran into the night. The fire. I don't know how it started. Thomas was drunk. Maybe he knocked over a lamp trying to chase me. Maybe he said it deliberately to destroy evidence. I heard later that they found 2 bodies. They assumed one was me because I'd been living there, taking care of Sarah. It seemed easier to stay dead than try to prove my innocence to people who'd never believed me anyway. Jonas absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. Jacob's going to say you set the fire. He's going to say you killed them both and tried to cover it up. I know. And without proof otherwise, without witnesses, it's your word against a dead man's reputation. I know that too. So we need to find proof, or witnesses, or something that shows Thomas was the monster you say he was. Clara laughed bitterly. Good luck with that. Everyone in Bitter Creek thought Thomas Creed was a fine, upstanding citizen. The kind of man who worked hard, paid his debts, tipped his hat to ladies. They didn't see what happened behind closed doors. They never do. Someone must have known. Someone must have seen something. Even if they did, they won't testify against the Creed family. Jacob owns half the town and everyone else is too scared to cross him. Jonas stood and began pacing, his mind working through possibilities. What about Sarah's friends? Other women she knew? She didn't have friends. Thomas didn't like her talking to other women, said they put ideas in her head. A doctor? Someone who might have treated her injuries? We couldn't afford the doctor, and even if we could, Thomas would never have allowed it. Then we make Jacob prove his case. We force him to show evidence, to go through proper channels. Jonas. Clara stood too, facing him across the room. There are no proper channels. There's no real law out here. Not for people like me. Jacob will come back with enough men to overwhelm you, and he'll take me. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. The hell there isn't. Please. She moved toward him, her eyes pleading. Please, Jonas, just let me go. Let me disappear again. I can run. I'm good at running. I'll head north, find another town, another name. You and Ella will be safe, and You'll what? Spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder? Waiting for someone else to recognize you, to drag up the past, to take you back to Bitter Creek in chains? He caught her shoulders gently. That's not living, Clara. That's just surviving, and there's a difference. At least I'd be surviving. At least you'd be safe. I don't want safe. I want right. They stood there, close enough that Jonas could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could feel the trembling in her shoulders that she was trying desperately to hide. She was terrified. Not for herself, he realized, but for him, for Ella, for the life she'd accidentally stumbled into and now cared about enough to sacrifice herself to protect. When had that happened? When had Clara Wynne stopped being a stranger and become someone whose fear for others outweighed her fear for herself? I won't let you go, Jonas said quietly. I won't let them take you. So we need a plan that doesn't involve either of those things. There is no plan. Jonas, you're not listening. No, you're not listening. His voice was firm now, carrying the tone he used with spooked horses and stubborn cattle. I've lived in Wyoming my whole life. I know how things work out here. I know that law is whatever the strongest man says it is, and I know that Jacob Creed thinks he's the strongest man in this territory. But he's wrong. How is he wrong? He has men, guns, the backing of everyone in Bitter Creek, and I have the truth. I have you, alive and willing to testify. I have a ranch that stood against worse than Jacob Creed, and I have something he doesn't, the respect of people in redemption who knew my father, who knew Catherine, who understand that justice isn't the same as revenge. Clara shook her head. You're being naive. Maybe. Or maybe I'm being exactly as stubborn as I need to be. He released her shoulders and moved to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. Tomorrow, we ride to Redemption. We talk to Sheriff Morrison, tell him everything, get it on record. Then we gather anyone who might testify on your behalf. People who saw Sarah's injuries, who heard Thomas's threats, who know what kind of man he really was. There is no one. Then we find them, or we make Jacob prove his case so thoroughly that even he can't justify hanging you without a trial. Jonas turned back to face her. But we don't run, and we don't give up. Understood? Clara stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, disbelief giving way to hope, hope giving way to something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Really? Tell me the truth. Jonas opened his mouth to give her the easy answer, the safe answer, the one that kept things simple and uncomplicated. But looking at her now, this fierce, damaged, extraordinary woman who'd walked into his life during a storm and refused to leave even when staying put her in danger, he found he couldn't lie. But because somewhere between that first night and now, you stopped being a stranger. Because Ella lights up when you enter the room. Because this house feels less like a tomb and more like a home when you're in it. Because... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Because, Clara prompted, moving closer. Because I can't lose someone else I care about. I just can't. So I'm going to fight, Clara. I'm going to fight for you the way I couldn't fight for Catherine. And maybe that's selfish. Maybe that's about me more than you, but it's the truth. The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid, with implications neither of them was ready to face. Then Ella made a small sound from her cradle, not quite a cry, just a request for attention, and the moment broke. Clara moved to pick up the baby, her movements automatic, soothing. Jonas watched them together in the lamplight and felt something settle in his chest, some certainty he hadn't known he was searching for. Tomorrow then, Clara said finally, bouncing Ella gently. We go to Redemption. We talk to the sheriff. We fight. Tomorrow, Jonas agreed. That night, neither of them slept well. Jonas lay in his bed listening to the house creak and settle, playing through scenarios in his mind, trying to anticipate what Jacob Creed might do next. Through the thin wall, he could hear Clara moving around in her room, restless and anxious. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on his door. Jonas? Clara's voice was barely audible. Are you awake? Yeah. The door opened, and she stood silhouetted in the doorway, wrapped in one of Catherine's old shawls. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see them coming back. See you getting hurt because of me. I'm not going to get hurt. You don't know that. No, he admitted. I don't. But I know I'd rather face Jacob Creed than face myself in the mirror if I let him take you without a fight. Clara moved into the room, sitting on the edge of his bed with the kind of casual intimacy that should have felt wrong but somehow didn't. Tell me about Catherine, please. I want to understand what I'm asking you to risk. So Jonas told her. About meeting Catherine at a dance in Redemption when he was 22 and she was 19, how she'd been visiting from Pennsylvania and had absolutely no business falling for a rancher with more dreams than sense. About their wedding in the small church with her family disapproving every minute of it, certain she was throwing her life away on frontier poverty. He told her about their first winter together, how they'd nearly starved because Jonas had misjudged his supplies, and Catherine had refused to admit she was hungry, saving her portions for him. About the morning she'd told him she was pregnant, and he'd been terrified and elated in equal measure. About Ella's birth, which had been difficult and dangerous and had left Catherine weak for weeks. She was getting stronger, Jonas said, his voice rough with old grief. Starting to feel like herself again. And then the fever came out of nowhere. One day she was fine, the next she was burning up. By the third day she couldn't even recognize me. She died calling for her mother who'd been dead 5 years. She never even got to say goodbye to Ella properly. Claire's hand found his in the darkness. I'm so sorry. Me too. Every damn day. He squeezed her hand gently. But Clara, here's what I learned from losing her. Regret is worse than fear. I regret not writing for the doctor sooner. I regret not having better medicine on hand. I regret every moment I wasted being scared instead of acting. So when Jacob Creed rode into my yard today threatening you, I didn't think about fear. I thought about regret. And I knew I'd regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't stand up. Even if it costs you everything? Even then, because Catherine taught me that the cost of doing nothing is always higher than the cost of trying. They sat together in the darkness, hands linked, while outside the wind began to rise again. It wasn't the howling fury of that first storm, but it was enough to rattle the shutters, to remind them that winter wasn't finished with Wyoming yet. Jonas, Clara said finally, if tomorrow doesn't go the way we hope, if the sheriff won't help, if there's no way to stop Jacob, will you promise me something? Depends on what it is. Promise you'll take care of Ella, that you won't do anything stupid trying to protect me, that you'll let me go if that's what it takes to keep her safe. Clara, promise me. Her voice was fierce now. She's innocent in all this. She deserves a father who lives, not a father who died playing hero for a woman who was already doomed. Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that wasn't how this worked, that he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. But looking at her in the shadows, this woman who'd suffered so much and yet still put a child's welfare above her own, he found himself nodding. I promise I'll keep Ella safe. No matter what. Thank you. She stood to leave, but Jonas caught her hand one more time. Clara, for what it's worth, you're not doomed. Not if I have anything to say about it. You're a good man, Jonas Mercer. Better than you know. I'm just a rancher who's too stubborn to quit. No. She squeezed his hand gently. You're someone who still believes in mercy in a place that's forgotten what it means. Catherine taught you well. She slipped out of the room then, leaving Jonas alone with his thoughts and his fears and his stubborn, probably foolish determination to do the right thing no matter the cost. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow would test whether frontier justice could be made to work for someone besides the strongest man with the most guns. Tomorrow would decide whether Clara Wynn's story ended in Wyoming snow or continued into something none of them could predict yet. But tonight, in the darkness of his bedroom, Jonas Mercer made himself a silent promise. No matter what came, he wouldn't become the kind of man who closed his door when someone knocked. He wouldn't become stone in a place that tried to turn everyone to stone eventually. He'd stay human, stay kind, stay willing to fight for what was right, even when right was impossibly hard. Catherine would have expected nothing less, and somehow, impossibly, that was enough to let him sleep. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that felt more like threat than promise. Jonas was up early, checking the horses, loading his rifle just in case, while Clara packed supplies for the journey to Redemption. Ella seemed to sense the tension, fussing more than usual until Clara sang to her in a voice that shook only slightly. They were nearly ready to leave when Samuel Pritchett rode up again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him came 4 more riders, ranchers Jonas knew by name if not by friendship. Hard men who'd carved lives out of impossible land, who understood that sometimes the only law was what neighbors decided to enforce together. "Heard you had visitors yesterday," Samuel said without preamble. "Jacob Creed and his boys. Word travels fast." "Word travels when it needs to. These men," Samuel gestured to the others, "they wanted to make sure you knew you weren't facing this alone." Jonas felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "I appreciate that, Samuel, but this isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. This came from Martin Walsh, a cattle rancher from 10 miles north. Jacob Creed's been throwing his weight around for years, thinking his money and his hired guns make him king. Someone needs to remind him that Wyoming territory doesn't have kings." "We stand with you," another man said, Pete Thornton, sheep farmer and proud of it. "Whatever comes." Clara had emerged from the house, and she stood on the porch now with Ella in her arms, staring at these rough, weathered men who'd ridden through the cold to help a woman they didn't even know. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely carrying. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "No, ma'am," Samuel said. "But we knew Jonas's father, knew his wife, know him. And if Jonas says you deserve protection, that's good enough for us. Besides," his weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile, "Frontier's got no use for men like Jacob Creed. Never has." Jonas looked at these men. Neighbors he'd kept at arm's length since Catherine's death, people he'd pushed away in his grief, and felt ashamed. He'd forgotten what community meant out here, how people survived impossible conditions by standing together when it mattered most. "Thank you," he said simply. "All of you." "Don't thank us yet," Martin said. "We're riding to redemption with you. Going to have a word with Sheriff Morrison ourselves. Make sure he understands this isn't just about one rancher and one woman. This is about whether we're going to let outsiders come in and terrorize our territory." "Morrison's a reasonable man," Pete added, "but he's also cautious. Having half a dozen respected ranchers backing your story might make him less cautious." They set out shortly after, a small convoy of riders with Jonas and Clara in the wagon and Ella bundled against the cold. As they rode, Jonas felt the weight of what these men were risking settle on his shoulders. They all had families, ranches, livelihoods that could be threatened if Jacob Creed decided to expand his revenge beyond just Clara. But they'd come anyway. They'd stood up anyway. Maybe, Jonas thought, there was still hope for this hard country after all. Redemption seemed busier than usual when they arrived, people moving through the streets with the purposeful energy of a town that knew something was about to happen. News of yesterday's confrontation had clearly spread, and Jonas could feel eyes tracking their group as they made their way to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Morrison was in his 50s, a former cavalry officer who'd settled in Redemption after retiring from military service. He was fair-minded but practical, the kind of lawman who understood that frontier justice was more about keeping the peace than enforcing every letter of the law. He looked up from his desk as the group filed into his small office, his expression unreadable. "Jonas Mercer," he said calmly, "I had a feeling you'd be coming by. And you brought friends." "We need to talk, Sheriff, about Clara Wynne and Jacob Creed." Morrison gestured to the chairs. "I figured. Jacob was here yesterday afternoon, making accusations. Said you're harboring a fugitive who killed his brother." "She's not a fugitive. She's a woman who defended herself against a violent man and then ran because she knew no one would believe her." "That's what she says." "Jacob's got a different story." Clara stepped forward then, her chin raised despite the way her hands trembled. "Sheriff Morrison, I'll tell you exactly what happened, everything, and then you can decide who's telling the truth." For the next hour, she laid out her story with painful detail. The other ranchers sat quietly, listening, while Jonas watched Morrison's face for any sign of judgment or dismissal. But the sheriff just took notes, asked clarifying questions, and treated Clara with the kind of professional respect Jonas hadn't dared hope for. When she finished, Morrison sat back in his chair. "That's quite a tale, Miss Wynne." "It's the truth." "Maybe so. But truth and proof are different things in a court of law. You got any evidence to back up your claims about Thomas Creed?" "I have my sister's body. Or I did, before the fire." Convenient, that fire. Sheriff, Jonas started, but Morrison held up a hand. I'm not saying I don't believe her, Jonas. I'm saying Jacob Creed is going to make these exact arguments, and we need to be prepared to counter them. He looked at Clara. You got any witnesses? Anyone who saw your sister's injuries? Heard Thomas's threats? Clara shook her head slowly. Thomas was careful. He didn't hurt her where people could see, and Sarah was too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening. What about the night she died? Anyone else there besides you and Thomas? No, just the three of us. Morrison sighed. Then it's your word against a dead man's reputation. That's a hard case to make. So what are you saying? Jonas demanded. That she should just let Jacob take her back to Bitter Creek to hang? I'm saying the law requires evidence, and right now we don't have much of it. We have her testimony, Samuel interjected. We have the fact that she came here peacefully, worked honestly, caused no trouble. We have Jonas's word that she's been nothing but helpful and good with his daughter. All of which speaks to her character now, Morrison agreed, but doesn't prove what happened in Bitter Creek. The room fell silent, hope draining away like water through cupped hands. Jonas felt rage building in his chest. Rage at the unfairness of it, at the way the system was stacked against women like Clara, at his own helplessness to fix it. Then Clara spoke again, her voice quiet but steady. What if there were other women? Other girls Thomas hurt before Sarah? Morrison's head snapped up. Were there? I don't know for certain, but Sarah mentioned once that she'd heard rumors, that Thomas had been engaged before years ago, and the girl had broken it off suddenly, disappeared from town without explanation. Sarah wondered if maybe Thomas had always been this way. You have a name? Elizabeth something. I never heard her last name. Morrison stood, moving to a filing cabinet in the corner. Elizabeth Brennan? She would have been from Bitter Creek maybe 6, 7 years ago? I don't know, maybe. The sheriff pulled out a file, flipping through papers. Elizabeth Brennan filed a complaint against Thomas Creed 7 years ago, claimed he'd assaulted her, threatened her, but she withdrew the complaint 2 weeks later and left town. He looked up. This could be something. If we could find her, get her to testify. That's a big if, Martin said. 7 years is a long time. She could be anywhere, could be dead. Or she could be alive and willing to help, Jonas countered. Sheriff, if we could find her, would her testimony be enough? Combined with Miss Wynn's story? It might be. At least enough to prevent Jacob from taking matters into his own hands. At least enough to force a real investigation instead of frontier justice. Then we find her, Jonas said with finality. Whatever it takes. Morrison nodded slowly. I'll send telegrams to nearby towns, see if anyone's heard of her. You men, he looked at the assembled ranchers. You keep watch on Jonas's ranch. If Jacob comes back before we have answers, you make sure he knows he's outnumbered. What about me? Claire asked. What am I supposed to do? You stay alive, Morrison said bluntly. You stay put, stay safe, and you pray we find Elizabeth Brennan before Jacob Creed loses patience. They left the sheriff's office with more hope than they'd arrived with, but Jonas knew it was fragile hope, the kind that could shatter with one wrong move. As they prepared for the ride back to the ranch, Reverend Thomas approached them in the street. Jonas, Miss Wynn, might I have a word? They stepped aside while the others loaded supplies into the wagon. The Reverend's kind eyes moved between them, seeing more than Jonas was comfortable with. I heard what's happening, the Reverend said quietly. The whole town has. And I want you to know that regardless of what the law decides, you both have the church's support. Thank you, Reverend, Clara said softly. But I also want to give you both some counsel, if you'll accept it. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You're playing a dangerous game, not just with Jacob Creed, but with your own hearts. I see the way you look at each other. I see the bond forming. And I worry that you're building something on a foundation of crisis that might not survive peace. Jonas felt his jaw tighten. Reverend, with all due respect, let me finish, please. I'm not judging you. Lord knows Catherine's death left a hole in your life that grief can't fill forever. And Miss Wynn, you've suffered losses I can't imagine. It's natural to reach for comfort, for connection, for someone who understands. But make sure that what you're feeling is real and not just the intensity of shared danger. Make sure you're choosing each other for the right reasons. He was right, Jonas realized with uncomfortable clarity. Everything between him and Clara had happened in the pressure cooker of crisis. The storm, the work, the threat of violence. They'd been pushed together by circumstance and necessity. Was what he felt for her real, or was it just loneliness and fear dressed up as something deeper? "I appreciate your concern, Reverend," Clara said, her voice measured. "But whatever Jonas and I are or aren't to each other, that's between us. Right now, I'm just trying to stay alive long enough to find out." Thomas nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. "Fair enough. But remember, both of you, that surviving isn't the same as living. And when this is over, you'll have to decide which one you want." He walked away, leaving them standing in the cold street with his words echoing between them. "Is he right?" Clara asked quietly. Are we just holding on to each other because we're scared?" Jonas thought about it, really thought about it. About the first night when he'd carried her inside against all his better judgment. About watching her work, listening to her sing to Ella, seeing her fierce pride and stubborn determination. About the way his house felt less empty with her in it, the way Ella smiled when Clara entered a room, the way he'd started planning futures that included someone besides just him and his daughter. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe, partly. But Clara, I don't think fear is the only thing here. I think there's something real underneath it. Something worth protecting. Even if it costs everything? Even then." She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her dark eyes. Then she reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. A promise, or maybe just an acknowledgement of possibility. "Let's get home," she said, "before Jacob decides to come calling again." They rode back to the ranch with their escort of ranchers, the winter afternoon turning the snow golden, the mountains distant and eternal on the horizon. And Jonas thought about Reverend Thomas's words, about the difference between surviving and living, about whether what he was feeling was real or just the desperate grasping of someone who'd been alone too long. But watching Clara cuddle Ella against her chest, hearing her soft singing carrying on the wind, seeing the way she'd stood up to a sheriff and a town's worth of judgment without flinching, he knew in his bones that this was real. Whether they survived long enough to act on it was the only question left. The answer came 3 days later, not from Sheriff Morrison's telegrams, but from an unexpected source that changed everything. Jonas was in the barn repairing tack when he heard the commotion, horses approaching fast, too fast for friendly visitors. He grabbed his rifle and ran outside to find Samuel Pritchett and 2 of the other ranchers riding hard toward the house, their horses lathered despite the cold. "Jonas!" Samuel shouted before he'd even dismounted. "Get Clara! Now! Jacob's coming, and he's brought an army!" Clara appeared in the doorway, Ella on her hip, her face pale. "How many?" 12, maybe 15 men, armed to the teeth. They're maybe 2 hours behind us." Samuel was breathing hard, whether from exertion or fear Jonas couldn't tell. "We rode ahead to warn you. The others are gathering everyone they can, but Jonas, there's too many of them. Even with help, we're outnumbered." Jonas's mind raced through options, discarding each as quickly as it formed. They couldn't fight 15 armed men. They couldn't run. Clara and Ella would never make it through the snow fast enough. They couldn't hide. Jacob would burn the ranch to the ground, looking for them. "There's a root cellar," Jonas said suddenly. "Under the house. Catherine used to store preserves down there. It's got a hidden entrance through the kitchen floor. Clara, you and Ella get down there now. Take supplies, blankets, whatever you need. If things go bad, you stay hidden no matter what you hear. Understood?" "Jonas, I'm not hiding while you—" "Yes, you are. This is about keeping Ella safe. That's what matters." His voice was harder than he'd intended, but there was no time for gentleness. "Please, Clara, do this for her." Something in his tone must have convinced her because she nodded and disappeared back into the house. Jonas turned to Samuel and the others. "How much time do we really have?" "Hour and a half, maybe. They stopped in Redemption first, probably looking for you there. Morrison tried to slow them down, but Jacob's got the law on his side now, brought a judge from Bitter Creek who swore out a warrant for Clara's arrest." "A judge from Bitter Creek? That's not legal." "Legal doesn't matter when you've got 15 guns backing you up." Samuel spat into the snow. "I'm sorry, Jonas, we tried. But this is going to get ugly, and I won't lie to you. We might not walk away from it." Jonas looked at these men who'd come to help him, who were willing to die for a woman they barely knew because it was the right thing to do. Men with families, with ranches of their own, with everything to lose. "You should go," he said quietly. "All of you. This isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't," Martin Walsh said, riding up with 3 more men behind him. "We sent word to everyone within 20 miles. Some are coming, some aren't. That's how it goes. But those of us here, we're not leaving." "Martin, Jonas, your father helped me build my first barn when I had nothing. Your wife delivered my youngest when my Sarah was too sick to travel to town. You think I'm going to abandon you now because some bully from Bitter Creek thinks he owns the territory?" Martin checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Not a chance." By the time they'd finished fortifying the ranch, moving hay bales for cover, positioning men at windows, ensuring clear lines of fire, they had 9 men total. 9 against 15, with Jonas's home and family caught in the middle. Clara emerged from the house one last time before Jonas made her go below. She'd changed into one of Catherine's old riding dresses, practical and worn, and her hair was pulled back severely from her face. She looked older somehow, hardened by the knowledge of what was coming. "I need you to know something," she said, pulling Jonas aside while the others made final preparations. "If Jacob takes me, if this goes the way I think it will, I need you to promise you won't blame yourself." "Clara, listen to me, please." Her voice was urgent, intense. "You gave me 3 weeks of peace. 3 weeks where I wasn't running, wasn't scared every second, wasn't alone. You gave me Ella's laughter and your terrible cooking and a home that felt real. That's more than I expected to ever have again. So if this is where it ends, if Jacob wins today, I want you to know I'm grateful. For all of it." Jonas felt something crack in his chest. "You're not going to die today. I won't let you. You might not have a choice." She reached up and touched his face gently, her hand cold against his cheek. "But Jonas, if something happens to me, take care of Ella. Love her enough for both of us. And don't let this break you. Catherine wouldn't want that. I don't want that. Stop talking like you're already gone." "I'm just being realistic." Then be realistic about this too. I'm not letting Jacob Creed take you. Not today. Not ever." He caught her hand, holding it against his face. "You hear me, Clara Wynne? You're staying here. You're staying with us. And when this is over, we're going to figure out what this thing between us is, and we're going to build something real. That's what's going to happen." She smiled then, sad and beautiful. "You're a dreamer, Jonas Mercer." Catherine used to say the same thing. He released her hand reluctantly. "Now get below. And Clara, if you hear shooting, if things sound bad, you take Ella and you run out the back tunnel. There's an old mining shaft that opens up half a mile north. Follow the creek bed. Samuel knows where it goes. Promise me you'll run if you have to." "I promise." She went inside then, and Jonas watched through the window as she descended into the root cellar with Ella, the trapdoor closing behind them like a coffin lid. Then he picked up his rifle and joined the other men in their waiting. The next hour crawled by like a wounded animal. The men talked in low voices, checking weapons, sharing what little tobacco they had, telling stories that were meant to ease tension but only highlighted how fragile everything was. Jonas couldn't stop thinking about Clara and Ella below, about how thin the floorboards were, about how little protection they'd have if bullets started flying. "Jonas," Samuel said quietly, moving beside him at the window, "if this goes south, if they breach the house, you get down there with them. We'll hold them off as long as we can. I'm not hiding while you fight my battle. It's not about hiding. It's about surviving. Someone needs to protect that baby, and Clara can't do it alone if she's scared out of her mind." Samuel's weathered face was grim. "Your father made me promise, the day before he died, that I'd look after you if anything happened. I'm looking after you now. So if I tell you to get down there, you get down there, understood?" Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to insist he'd stand and fight no matter what, but he knew Samuel was right. Ella had to come first. Everything else was secondary to keeping her safe. "Understood," he said finally. "Good. Now," Samuel went still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "There. You see that?" Jonas looked where Samuel pointed and felt his stomach drop. A line of riders cresting the ridge, moving with the slow confidence of people who knew they had the numbers and the law on their side. 15 men, just like Samuel had said, with Jacob Creed at the front riding a black horse that matched his dark clothes. They came on steadily, not hurrying, taking their time. Jonas watched through the rifle sight as they spread out in a rough semicircle around the house, positioning themselves to cover all exits. Professional. Organized. This wasn't going to be a negotiation, this was a siege. Jacob rode forward alone, stopping just beyond rifle range. "Jonas Mercer," his voice carried clearly in the cold air. "I know you're in there, and I know you've got Clara Wynne with you. Send her out, and nobody needs to get hurt." Jonas moved to the door but didn't open it, shouting through the heavy wood. "She's under my protection, Creed. You want her, you go through proper legal channels." "I've got proper legal channels right here." Jacob held up a piece of paper. "Warrant signed by Judge Harrison of Bitter Creek, authorizing me to retrieve a fugitive from justice. That's as legal as it gets." "Harrison's got no jurisdiction in Wyoming territory. He's got jurisdiction wherever I say he does." Jacob's voice turned colder. "You're outgunned and outmanned, Mercer. You've got maybe 8, 9 men in there. I've got 15. Math's not in your favor." "Maybe not, but we've got the high ground and good cover. You come at us, you'll lose men. Maybe a lot of men. That worth it to you?" "Worth it? Hell yes, it's worth it. That woman killed my brother. She's going to answer for it." "She defended herself against a man who murdered her sister," Jonas shouted back. "Your brother was a monster, Creed. Everyone in Bitter Creek knows it. They're just too scared to say it." The silence that followed was dangerous. Jonas could see Jacob's shoulders tense, could feel the rage radiating across the distance between them. "You've got 1 hour," Jacob finally said. 1 hour to send her out. After that, we come in and take her. And anyone standing in our way dies. That includes you, Mercer. That includes every man who rode here thinking he could play hero. 1 hour. That's all the mercy you get." He wheeled his horse around and rode back to his men. They settled into positions, rifles ready, waiting. The siege had begun. Inside the house, the men looked at each other with the grim understanding of people facing impossible odds. "We could fight," Martin said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Make them pay for every inch." "And get everyone killed," Samuel countered. "Jonas, there's got to be another way." "There isn't. Not unless—" Jonas stopped, an idea forming. Desperate, probably stupid, but maybe their only chance. "What if we buy time? What if we pretend to negotiate while Morrison gets here with help?" Morrison's in redemption. Even if someone rode for him the moment Jacob's men arrived, he's hours away. Then we need to stretch that hour as long as possible. Keep talking, keep stalling, keep Jacob thinking there's a chance we'll give in. "You think he'll believe that?" "I think he's arrogant enough to believe anything that serves his purposes." Jonas moved away from the window. "Samuel, you and Martin keep watch. The rest of you, check ammunition. Make sure we're ready if this goes bad. I'm going to try talking to Jacob again, see if I can drag this out." He opened the door a crack and shouted, "Creed, I want to talk, just you and me, halfway between your line and mine." A long pause. Then Jacob rode forward slowly. Jonas stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed down, and walked to meet him in the snow-covered yard. Up close, Jacob looked even more dangerous than Jonas remembered. His eyes were flat and cold, the eyes of someone who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. But there was also grief there, hidden beneath the anger, real pain over his brother's death, twisted into something ugly by pride and the need for vengeance. "You're wasting time, Mercer." "Maybe, but I figure we should talk before people start dying." Jonas kept his voice level, reasonable. "Your brother's dead. Nothing I do or you do changes that, but killing more people won't bring him back. It'll give me satisfaction." "Will it? Or will you just have more blood on your hands and still be empty inside?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me or what I'm feeling. I know grief. I know what it's like to lose someone you love and want someone to blame. But Clara didn't kill your brother out of meanness or greed. She was trying to survive, that's all. She pushed him down the stairs. That's murder. It's self-defense. Thomas killed her sister. He would have killed Clara too if she hadn't fought back. That's her version. I've got a different one. From who? Thomas is dead. Sarah's dead. Clara's the only witness left, and you're determined not to believe her because it's easier to make her a villain than admit your brother was a monster. Jacob's hand drifted toward his gun. Careful, Mercer. You're talking about my blood. I'm talking about the truth. And somewhere under all that anger, you know I'm right. You know what Thomas was capable of. Jonas took a risk, reading the flicker of doubt in Jacob's eyes. You knew even before this happened, didn't you? You knew he had a temper, knew he'd hurt women before. But you looked the other way because he was family. Shut your mouth. Elizabeth Brennan, that name mean anything to you? Jacob went very still. Where'd you hear that name? Sheriff Morrison's been digging. Turns out your brother had a pattern. Elizabeth wasn't the first girl he hurt, and Sarah wasn't the last. How many others, Jacob? How many women did you ignore because it was easier than facing what your brother really was? I said shut up! Jacob's voice was shaking now, whether with rage or something else Jonas couldn't tell. You want justice? Then help us find it. Real justice, not the revenge kind. Help us find Elizabeth, get her testimony, show everyone what really happened. Let the truth come out. The truth is Clara Wynne killed my brother and burned his house down. That's the only truth I need. Then you're no better than he was. Just another bully who thinks power makes you right. Jacob's hand went for his gun, but Jonas was faster, bringing up his rifle. They stood there frozen, weapons trained on each other, while behind them both sides tensed for violence. This how you want it to end? Jonas asked quietly. Both of us dead in the snow while our people watch? Better than letting a killer walk free. She's not a killer, she's a survivor. And if you were half the man you think you are, you'd recognize the difference. They held position for another heartbeat, another breath. Then Jacob slowly lowered his gun, and Jonas did the same. You've got 45 minutes, Jacob said. Then we're coming in. He rode back to his men, and Jonas returned to the house, his legs shaking with adrenaline. The men inside looked at him with questions in their eyes. Did it work? Samuel asked. Did you buy us time? Some. Not enough. Jonas moved to the trapdoor, knocking twice, the signal he and Clara had agreed on. It opened, and her pale face looked up at him. I heard shouting. Jacob's giving us 45 minutes, then he attacks. Jonas knelt by the opening. Clara, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Elizabeth Brennan. Anything that might help us find her. Jonas, there's no time. There's exactly 45 minutes. That's more than enough if we're lucky. Now think. Elizabeth Brennan. What did Sarah tell you about her? Clara climbed up into the kitchen, Ella asleep against her shoulder. Not much. Just that she'd been engaged to Thomas years ago, that she'd broken it off suddenly and left town. Sarah heard rumors that Elizabeth had family somewhere north, Montana Territory maybe, but that was years ago. She could be anywhere now. Or she could be exactly where Sheriff Morrison's been looking. Jonas grabbed his coat. I'm riding to redemption. If Morrison found her, if there's any chance she's willing to testify. You don't have time to get there and back, Martin protested. It's an hour's ride each way, minimum. Then I'd better ride fast, Jonas looked at Samuel. You're in charge here. If Jacob attacks before I get back, you hold him off as long as you can. But if it's clear you can't win, if men are dying, you let Clara go. You don't sacrifice everyone for one person. Understood? Jonas? That's an order, Samuel. I'm not letting good men die because I'm too stubborn to accept reality. He turned to Clara. And you? If it comes to that, you go with Jacob. You don't fight. You don't resist. You stay alive long enough for the truth to come out. Promise me. I'm not promising anything that ends with you dead, Clara said, but her voice shook. Promise me anyway. She closed her eyes briefly. I promise. But Jonas, come back. Please come back. He wanted to kiss her then, wanted to pull her close and tell her everything he'd been feeling but couldn't quite articulate. But there were 8 men watching, and 45 minutes ticking away, and no time for the words that mattered. Keep Ella safe, he said instead, and it meant everything else too. Then he was out the back door, running for the barn where Thunder waited. He saddled the horse in record time, ignoring the protests of the men who thought this was suicide, ignoring the voice in his head that agreed with them. He rode out through the back trail, the one that wound through the forest where Jacob's men couldn't see, and pushed Thunder to a gallop the moment they cleared the trees. The horse responded magnificently, stretching out into a run that ate up ground like they were racing against death itself. Which, Jonas supposed they were. The ride to redemption blurred into a single continuous moment of pounding hooves and gasping breaths, and prayer to a God Jonas wasn't sure was listening anymore. He made it in 40 minutes, a miracle of speed and luck, and nearly crashed through the door of Sheriff Morrison's office. "Elizabeth Brennan," he gasped, barely able to speak. "Did you find her?" Morrison looked up from his desk, startled. "Jonas, what the... Did you find her?" "Yes, but where?" "She's here, in Redemption. Been living under a different name for the past 6 years. I just located her this morning. But Jonas, I need her. Now. Jacob Creed has my ranch surrounded with 15 armed men. He's going to attack in..." Jonas checked his pocket watch. "In 30 minutes. If Elizabeth can testify about what Thomas did to her, it might be enough to stop him." Morrison was already moving, grabbing his coat and gun belt. "She's at the boarding house, but Jonas, she's terrified. She wouldn't even talk to me until I promised her protection. Getting her to testify, I'll convince her. Just get me there." They ran through the streets, Morrison shouting for his 2 deputies to follow. The boarding house was on the east side of town, a neat 2-story building run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. Morrison knocked hard. "Sheriff?" Mrs. Patterson opened the door, looking alarmed. "What's wrong?" "Elizabeth Brennan. I need to see her. Now." "She's upstairs, but she said she didn't want to be disturbed." Jonas pushed past her, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Morrison called after him with a room number, and Jonas found the right door, knocking hard. "Miss Brennan? My name is Jonas Mercer. I need to talk to you about Thomas Creed." Silence. Then a woman's voice, thin with fear. "Go away." "I can't. There's a woman who's about to die because of what Thomas did, and you're the only one who can save her. Please. Just 5 minutes." "I can't help you." "Yes, you can. You're the only one who can." Jonas pressed his forehead against the door, exhaustion and desperation making his voice raw. "Miss Brennan, Elizabeth, I know you're scared. I know Thomas hurt you, but there's another woman, Clara Wynne, and her sister died because of him. And now his brother is coming to kill her for defending herself. If you don't help, if you don't tell the truth about what Thomas was, she's going to die. Please." The lock clicked. The door opened a crack, revealing a woman in her early 30s with brown hair and haunted eyes. She looked at Jonas with the kind of wary fear that spoke of old wounds never properly healed. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. "Tell the truth. Tell what Thomas did to you. Come with me and tell Jacob Creed that his brother was a violent man who hurt women. That's all." "He'll kill me. Jacob will." "He won't. I won't let him. Sheriff Morrison won't let him." Jonas caught her hand gently. "I know it's asking everything. I know it's terrifying. But Elizabeth, if you don't do this, an innocent woman dies. And her baby, her 8-month-old baby, grows up without a mother. You have the power to stop that. You're the only one who does." She stared at him for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. "I was 17 when Thomas courted me. I thought he was so charming, so sophisticated. By the time I understood what he really was, it was too late. He'd already..." She stopped, unable to finish. "I know, and I'm so sorry that happened to you, but you survived it. You got away. Now help Clara do the same." Elizabeth Brennan wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "If I do this, if I testify, I can never come back here. I'll have to run again, start over somewhere else. I'll help you, whatever you need. Money, a horse, supplies. I'll make sure you have it. You have my word." She looked at Morrison, who nodded confirmation. Then she looked back at Jonas and made the decision that would save or damn them all. "All right, I'll do it, but we need to hurry." They rode back to the ranch in a group, Jonas and Elizabeth, Morrison and his 2 deputies, all of them pushing their horses to the limit. Jonas kept checking his pocket watch, watching the minutes tick away. 35 minutes since he'd left. 40, 45. Please let us be in time. Please let them still be alive. They crested the final ridge, and Jonas's heart seized. Smoke was rising from the ranch, not a lot, just a thin column, but enough to mean shots had been fired, something had happened. He spurred Thunder to one final burst of speed, racing down the slope with Elizabeth and the others behind him. The scene that met them was chaos barely contained. Jacob's men had moved closer to the house, and there were burn marks on the porch where someone had thrown a torch. But the house still stood, and Jonas could see movement in the windows. Samuel and the others, still fighting, still holding. Jacob saw them coming and turned his horse, confusion flickering across his face when he saw the size of Jonas's reinforcements. Morrison rode forward, his star glinting in the afternoon sun. "Jacob Creed, I'm ordering you to stand down. Now." "On what authority? You've got no jurisdiction here." "I've got the authority of Wyoming Territory law, which supersedes any warrant from Bitter Creek, and I've got new evidence in the case of Thomas Creed's death." Morrison gestured to Elizabeth. "Evidence you're going to want to hear." Jacob's eyes narrowed when he saw the woman beside Jonas. "Who's that?" "Someone who knew your brother very well." Jonas helped Elizabeth down from her horse. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand, but she faced Jacob with a courage Jonas had to admire. "Tell him, Elizabeth. Tell him what Thomas Creed was really like." "My name is Elizabeth Brennan," she said, her voice barely audible. 7 years ago, I was engaged to Thomas Creed, and he nearly killed me." The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. Jacob's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, confusion, before settling into something harder to read. "That's a lie. Thomas never—" "He broke my arm in 2 places," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger. "He fractured my ribs. He told me if I ever told anyone, he'd burn down my family's house with them inside. So I ran. I changed my name. I've spent 7 years looking over my shoulder, terrified he'd find me." She looked directly at Jacob. "Your brother was a monster. And I'm sorry he's dead, but I'm not sorry Clara Wynne survived him. She deserves to live. She deserves justice." Jacob sat frozen on his horse, and Jonas could see the moment it all crashed down on him. The denial, the anger, the grief twisted into something that finally had to face truth. "You're lying," Jacob said, but there was no conviction in it. "I have medical records," Elizabeth said. "Dr. Hendricks in Bitter Creek treated me. He'll confirm everything, and I'm willing to swear to all of it in any court you want." Morrison moved his horse closer to Jacob. "It's over, Creed. The warrant's invalid, and you know it. If you pursue this, if you hurt anyone here, you're the one breaking the law. And I will arrest you." For a long moment, everything hung in balance. Jacob's men looked uncertain, hands on weapons but eyes on their leader, waiting for a signal that would determine whether this ended in peace or bloodshed. Then Jacob's shoulders sagged. Not defeat, exactly, but the exhaustion of someone who'd finally run out of fight. "My brother," he said quietly. "My brother really did all that?" "Yes," Elizabeth said simply. "And Clara Wynne was defending herself, just like I wish I'd been brave enough to do." Jacob looked at the house, at the ranch, at all the men positioned to kill each other over a truth he'd refused to see. "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." "Maybe you didn't want to know," Jonas said, not unkindly. "Maybe it was easier to believe Clara was a killer than admit your brother was. But now you know. So what are you going to do about it?" The silence stretched so long Jonas thought it might break into violence after all. Then Jacob wheeled his horse around, calling to his men. "We're leaving. It's done." "Jacob," one of them protested, but Jacob cut him off. "I said it's done. My brother he was not the man I thought he was, and I won't kill innocent people over a lie." He looked back at Jonas one last time. "Tell Clara Wynne she's free. Tell her I'm sorry for what my brother did to her sister. It won't bring anyone back, but it's the truth." He rode away then, his men following, leaving Jonas and the others standing in the snow, watching them disappear over the ridge. It was over. Just like that. After all the fear, all the preparation, all the certainty that this would end in blood, it was just over. Jonas's legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the snow, shaking with relief so intense it felt like sickness. Morrison was beside him in moments. "You all right, son?" Yeah, I think so." Jonas looked up at the house, where faces were appearing in windows, where the door was opening to reveal Samuel and the others alive and whole. Is it really over? For now, I'll make sure it stays that way. Get Elizabeth's testimony documented, file reports, make it official. Morrison offered Jonas his hand and pulled him to his feet. You did good here. Risked everything to do what was right. That takes guts. Or stupidity. Still haven't figured out which. Both, probably. The best things usually are. Jonas walked toward the house on unsteady legs, and the door opened fully to reveal Clara standing there with Ella in her arms. She looked at him with eyes full of tears, and something else. Relief, gratitude, joy, all mixed together. And Jonas felt something in his chest that had been tight for months finally loosen. It's over, he said. Jacob knows the truth. You're safe. Clara made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she was moving toward him, Ella between them, and Jonas caught them both in his arms and held on like drowning man holds to driftwood. You came back, Clara whispered against his chest. You actually came back. Told you I would. You're insane. You rode into town with 15 armed men ready to kill you. You brought back a witness in less than an hour. She pulled back to look at him, and Jonas saw wonder in her eyes. You saved me. We saved you. Elizabeth, Morrison, Samuel, all of them. But Jonas couldn't stop looking at her, at the way the afternoon light caught her hair, at the tears on her cheeks that were happy tears for once. But Clara, I need to tell you something. What? I didn't do this just to save you. I did it because... He stopped, aware of all the people watching, aware that this moment was public and messy, and nothing like the romantic declarations Catherine used to read about in her novels. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that made it perfect. I did it because somewhere along the way, you stopped being a stranger. You became family, and I protect my family. Always. Clara's eyes filled with fresh tears. Jonas Mercer, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I want you to stay. Not as help. Not as someone paying off a debt. Just stay. Be here. Be part of this. He looked down at Ella, who was watching them both with her serious dark eyes. Be part of us. For how long? Long as you want. Forever. If that's something you'd consider. She laughed then, the sound bright and free and full of all the hope Jonas had thought was dead in both of them. Forever's a long time. I know, but I figure if we survived the last few weeks, we can probably survive anything. That's terrible logic. Catherine used to tell me the same thing. Jonas smiled, and it felt like the first real smile he'd managed since his wife's death. But I'm too stubborn to listen. I know. Clara reached up and touched his face, her hand warm despite the cold. It's one of the things I love about you. The word hung between them, bright and terrifying and perfect. Love. She'd said love. Clara, I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. I know all the reasons why this is crazy. She was talking fast now, the words tumbling out. But Jonas, I don't care. I love you. I love Ella. I love this ranch and this life and everything we've built together. And if you're offering me forever, then yes. Yes, I'll stay. Jonas kissed her then, with Ella between them and an audience of ranchers and lawmen watching and snow starting to fall again like benediction. He kissed her like a promise, like a beginning, like the answer to every question he'd been too afraid to ask. When they finally broke apart, Samuel was grinning. About damn time. Shut up, Samuel, Jonas said, but he was smiling too. They went inside then, all of them. The ranchers who'd stood with him, Morrison and his deputies, Elizabeth who'd been brave enough to tell the truth, Clara and Ella, and Jonas himself. They crowded into the small house that had been Catherine's dream and was now becoming something new, something that honored her memory while making space for the future. Someone found whiskey, and someone else found tin cups, and they raised a toast to survival and justice and the stubborn courage of women who refused to be victims. They raised a toast to Clara, to Elizabeth, to Catherine's memory, to Ella's future. They raised a toast to the truth and to the hard men who'd stood for it when standing was dangerous. And as the sun set over the Holloway Ranch, painting the snow orange and gold, Jonas Mercer stood with Clara Wynne in the warm circle of firelight and understood that mercy wasn't weakness, kindness wasn't naivety, and opening your door when someone knocked, even when it was midnight and storming and every rational part of you screamed danger, sometimes saved not just them, but you too. The wind had finally stopped blowing, the storm had passed, and in its wake, something new was beginning to grow. Something that looked an awful lot like home. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it transformed the Holloway Ranch into something Jonas barely recognized. The snow melted slowly, revealing grass that had survived beneath the white blanket, tough and green and determined. The cottonwood tree Catherine had planted put out new leaves that rustled in the wind. A gentler wind now, one that whispered instead of howled. And everywhere Jonas looked, he saw evidence of change, of growth, of life insisting on itself despite everything winter had tried to do. Clara stood in the garden she'd started planning in February, mapping out rows for vegetables with a stick in the still soft earth. Ella sat nearby on a blanket, playing with wooden blocks Samuel had carved for her, babbling happily to herself in the language only babies spoke. The morning sun made Clara's dark hair shine, and Jonas found himself just watching them, memorizing this moment the way he used to memorize Catherine's face by lamplight. "You're staring again," Clara said without turning around. "Can't help it. You're nice to look at." Flatterer. But she smiled as she said it, and Jonas saw the way her shoulders relaxed, the way she'd stopped constantly looking over her shoulder for threats that no longer came. 3 months since Jacob Creed had ridden away. 3 months of peace that still felt fragile, like something that might shatter if they acknowledged it too directly. Jonas crossed the yard to join her, settling on the blanket beside Ella. His daughter immediately crawled into his lap, sticky hands grabbing at his shirt, and he caught her easily, settling her weight against his chest. "She's getting so big," he said, more to himself than Clara. "She'll be walking soon. Then we'll really have our hands full." Clara knelt beside them, using her stick to draw patterns in the dirt. "I was thinking we could plant tomatoes here, and maybe some beans along this row." "Carrots for Ella. She'll need vegetables once she's eating solid food. You've got this all figured out." "Someone has to. You just plant everything randomly and hope it grew." She tapped his knee with her stick, teasing. "You're good at many things, Jonas Mercer, but planning isn't one of them." "That's what I have you for." The words came out naturally, easily, like they'd always belonged together. And maybe they had. Maybe from that first night when Clara had knocked and Jonas had answered, they'd been moving toward this moment, this garden, this spring, this family they were building from broken pieces. "Jonas," Clara said, her voice shifting to something more serious, "I got a letter yesterday. From Elizabeth." Jonas straightened, paying attention. Elizabeth Brennan had left Redemption the day after testifying, heading north with the money Jonas had given her and a promise that she'd write when she was settled somewhere safe. They'd heard nothing until now. "What did she say?" "She's in Montana, a town called Helena. She got work as a seamstress, and she's—" Clara paused, emotion catching in her voice. "She's happy, Jonas. She wrote that she sleeps through the night now without nightmares, that she's not afraid anymore. And she thanked us. Thanked you specifically for giving her the courage to tell the truth." "I didn't do anything. She's the one who was brave." "You gave her a reason to be brave. You showed her that standing up for what's right actually matters." Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You showed me that too." Jonas shifted Ella to one arm so he could take Clara's hand. "You were already brave. You walked through a blizzard rather than take charity. You worked until your hands bled. You stood up to Jacob Creed even when you thought you were going to die. Don't give me credit for courage you already had. But I wouldn't have used it without you, without this place." She squeezed his hand. "You gave me a home, Jonas. You gave me back my life. You did the same for me. This ranch was dying before you came. I was dying. And now—" He looked around at the garden taking shape, at Ella playing contentedly, at the house with its repaired shutters and fresh paint. Now everything's growing again. They sat together in the morning sun while Ella played and the wind whispered through new leaves. After a while, Samuel Pritchett rode up, but his expression was friendlier than Jonas had seen in years. "Morning, folks. Brought you something?" He dismounted and pulled a newspaper from his saddlebag, handing it to Jonas. "Made the papers. Thought you'd want to see." Jonas unfolded the newspaper, the Wyoming Territorial Gazette, and found the article Samuel had marked. The headline read, "Woman's Testimony Exposes Abuse, Prevents Hanging." The story detailed Clara's case, Elizabeth's courage in coming forward, and the way a community had stood together to demand justice instead of revenge. "We're famous," Clara said, reading over his shoulder. "Or infamous. Depends on who's doing the judging." "Well, I think it's damn fine," Samuel said. "Maybe it'll make other women realize they don't have to stay silent. That they've got people who'll believe them, who'll fight for them." He tipped his hat. "Anyway, just wanted to drop that off. My Sarah says to tell you she's making a pie for the gathering tomorrow. Said she expects both of you to be there." "Gathering?" Jonas asked. "Church social, first one of spring. Everyone's coming, even the Johnsons, and they haven't socialized since their youngest ran off last year. Sarah's insisting you come. Says it's time Clara met the whole community properly, not just during a crisis." Clara looked uncertain. "I don't know if that's a good idea. People will stare. They'll judge." "Let them," Samuel interrupted. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of, girl. You survived something terrible, and you did it with dignity. Anyone who judges you for that isn't worth your time anyway." He swung back into his saddle. "Tomorrow, 1 o'clock. Don't make me send Sarah to drag you there." He rode off, leaving Jonas and Clara staring at each other with matching expressions of mild panic. "A church social," Clara said faintly, "with the entire community. We could skip it. And have Sarah Pritchett hunting us down? I don't think so." Clara stood, brushing dirt from her dress. "Besides, he's right. We can't hide forever. If we're going to build a life here, we need to be part of the community, no matter how uncomfortable that is." "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just weren't paying attention." The next afternoon found them dressed in their best clothes. Jonas in the suit he'd worn to his wedding and Catherine's funeral, Clara in a dress she'd remade from one of Catherine's prettier gowns. Ella wore a new outfit Clara had sewn herself, white with tiny blue flowers embroidered at the collar. They looked like a family. They felt like one too. The church was packed when they arrived, every pew filled with ranchers and their families, townspeople from Redemption, even Reverend Thomas standing at the front with a welcoming smile. Conversations died when Jonas, Clara, and Ella entered, dozens of eyes turning to track their progress. Jonas felt Clara tense beside him, felt her instinct to run warring with her determination to stay. He took her hand, squeezing gently. "We walk in together. We show them we're not ashamed." "I'm terrified." "Me too. But we do it anyway." They walked down the center aisle with Ella between them, Clara holding the baby, while Jonas kept his hand on Clara's back. The silence was oppressive, judgmental, exactly what Jonas had feared. Then Samuel Pritchett stood up from his pew. "Welcome, Jonas." "Welcome, Clara. We saved you seats up front." Others began standing too. Martin Walsh and his family, Pete Thornton and his wife, the men who'd stood with Jonas during the siege and the women who'd supported their decision. One by one, they stood in silent solidarity, transforming what could have been condemnation into acceptance. By the time Jonas and Clara reached the front pew, half the church was standing. And when they sat down, Sarah Pritchett leaned over and whispered, "You look beautiful, dear, both of you." Clara's hand found Jonas's, gripping tight, and he knew she was fighting tears. But these were different tears than the ones she'd shed in fear and desperation. These were tears of belonging, of finally having a place where she didn't have to hide or run or pretend to be someone she wasn't. Reverend Thomas stepped forward, and the congregation settled. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we gather today to celebrate spring, the season of renewal, of growth, of life returning after long winter. And I can think of no better example of that renewal than what we've witnessed in our own community these past months." He looked directly at Clara and Jonas. "We've seen courage in the face of fear. We've seen truth triumph over lies. We've seen neighbors stand together when it would have been easier to look away. And most importantly, we've seen that mercy and justice are not opposites, but partners in building a community worth belonging to." The service continued with hymns and prayers, with children squirming in pews and babies, including Ella, making their presence known with perfectly timed interruptions. It was chaotic and noisy and utterly normal, and Jonas found himself relaxing into it, letting the ordinariness wash over him like absolution. After the service, there was food, tables laden with pies and casseroles, roasted meats and fresh bread, all the bounty a community could produce when everyone contributed. People approached Jonas and Clara tentatively at first, then with more confidence as they realized they wouldn't be rebuffed. "My daughter's been asking about you," Mrs. Henderson said to Clara, a toddler clinging to her skirts. "She heard you were good with sewing. Would you consider teaching her? I'd pay, of course." "I'd be happy to," Clara said, surprised. "No payment necessary. I'm always glad to pass on the skill." "Well, if you're sure," Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Maybe we could work out a trade? My husband's a blacksmith. If you need any tools repaired, actually, we do need new hinges for the barn door." And just like that, Clara was part of the community's informal economy of trades and favors, the web of mutual support that kept frontier life functioning. Jonas watched her negotiate and smile and gradually relax into conversation, and he felt something warm settle in his chest. Harold Chen approached with his wife and 2 young sons. "Jonas, Clara, good to see you both." "Clara, those pieces you made sold within days. I've got 3 customers asking for more if you're willing." "I am. Thank you, Harold." "Don't thank me. Thank your talent. You've got a real gift." He lowered his voice slightly. "And Clara, if you ever need anything, supplies, credit, just someone to talk to, my door is always open. What you survived, what you fought through, my wife and I want you to know you've got friends here." "Thank you," Clara whispered. "That means more than you know." The afternoon stretched long and golden, filled with laughter and food, and the particular kind of chaos that came from having dozens of children running wild while adults pretended to supervise. Ella found herself being passed from person to person, accumulating admirers and sticky fingers with equal enthusiasm. Jonas ended up in conversation with a group of ranchers discussing cattle prices and water rights, the ordinary business of ordinary life. But his eyes kept drifting to Clara, watching her teach Mrs. Henderson's daughter the basic stitches, watching her laugh at something Sarah Pritchett said, watching her slowly transform from the terrified woman who'd collapsed in his yard to someone who belonged. "You're going to marry her, aren't you?" Samuel said quietly, appearing at Jonas's elbow. "Haven't asked yet." "But you're planning to." Jonas didn't deny it. "Would that bother you? Catherine's barely been gone 6 months. "Catherine's been gone 6 months," Samuel interrupted. "And in that time, you've survived an impossible winter, protected someone who needed protecting, and rebuilt something that was dying into something that lives again. You think Catherine would be angry about that? She'd be proud." The old man's eyes were kind. "She'd want you to be happy, Jonas. She'd want Ella to have a mother. And if Clara's the one who makes both those things possible, then Catherine would be the first one pushing you toward the altar." "I miss her," Jonas said quietly. "Every day, I miss her." "Of course you do. That's how love works. It doesn't disappear just because the person does." "But Jonas, missing Catherine doesn't mean you can't love Clara too. The heart's got more room than we think." "Is that wisdom or wishful thinking?" "Both, probably. The best advice usually is." As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, families started packing up to head home before dark. Jonas and Clara helped clean, gathering dishes, and folding blankets, working side by side with the easy coordination of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. "That wasn't as terrible as I expected," Clara admitted as they loaded their wagon. High praise. "I mean it. People were kind, accepting. I didn't expect that. People surprise you sometimes, usually right when you've given up expecting anything good from them." Jonas settled Ella in her basket, tucking blankets around her. "Clara, there's something I want to talk to you about, but not here. When we get home?" Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. Better than fine. I have something to ask you, something important." They rode home through the spring evening, the air soft and warm, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Ella fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the wagon's motion, and Jonas and Clara sat side by side in comfortable silence. When they reached the ranch, Jonas put the horses away while Clara carried Ella inside and put her to bed. By the time he came in, Clara had started a fire and was making tea, her movements automatic and domestic in the space that had become as much hers as his. "So," she said, handing him a cup. "What did you want to talk about?" Jonas took a sip of tea, buying time, trying to organize words that seemed determined to tangle on his tongue. Finally, he just set down the cup and faced her directly. "I've been thinking about the future, about what comes next for all of us." "All right." "The ranch is doing better. We've got enough cattle to make it through another winter, assuming nothing catastrophic happens. Harold's selling your work faster than you can make it. Ella's healthy and happy. Everything is stable. For the first time since Catherine died, everything feels solid." "That's good, isn't it?" "It's very good. But Clara, I don't want stable if it means you're still just helping. I don't want solid if it means we're just pretending this is temporary." He took her hands, holding them gently. "I want permanent. I want forever. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here not because you owe me or because you're running from something, but because you chose to stay." Clara's eyes widened. "Jonas!" "Let me finish, please." He took a breath. "I know it's fast. I know Catherine hasn't been gone long. I know people will talk and judge and say it's inappropriate. But Clara, I don't care. Catherine taught me that life's too short to waste on should-haves and might-have-beens. She taught me to grab hold of good things when they show up and not let go just because it's uncomfortable or complicated." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying marry me. Not because it's practical, though it is. Not because Ella needs a mother, though she does. But because I love you. Because you make this house feel like a home again. Because I can't imagine my future without you in it." He squeezed her hands. "Marry me, Clara Wynne. Make this permanent. Make this real." Clara stared at him with tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling in his. "You love me? Is that really the surprising part of this conversation?" "Yes. Jonas, I hoped, but I didn't dare believe that you might actually—" She laughed through her tears. "You love me?" "More than I thought possible. More than makes sense given how short a time we've known each other. But yes, Clara, I love you. I love you too. I've loved you since the night you let me stay. Since you gave me Catherine's shawl and your trust and a chance to be more than just a woman running from her past." She pulled her hands free and touched his face. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Yes to everything." Jonas kissed her then, properly this time, without an audience or a crisis forcing the moment. He kissed her like a promise, like a beginning, like the answer to every prayer he'd been too afraid to voice. And when they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing and trying to catch their breath. "When?" Clara asked. "When should we—" "Soon. Tomorrow if Reverend Thomas will do it. Next week if he won't." Jonas grinned at her stunned expression. "What? You think I'm going to wait months and risk you changing your mind?" "I'm not going to change my mind." "Good. Then there's no reason to wait." They were married 3 weeks later in the same church where they'd attended the social with the entire community in attendance. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric Harold Chen had donated, cream-colored cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and sleeves, simple and beautiful. Jonas wore his Sunday suit with a new shirt Sarah Pritchett had insisted on making. Ella attended too, passed between Sarah and Mrs. Henderson during the ceremony, gurgling happily at all the attention. And when Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause that sounded like homecoming. The reception afterward was held at the ranch, with neighbors contributing food and labor to transform the property into something festive. Someone had strung up lanterns. Someone else had brought a fiddle. And as the sun set and the dancing began, Jonas found himself watching Clara waltz with Samuel Pritchett, her face flushed and happy, and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "She's good for you," a voice said beside him. Jonas turned to find Sheriff Morrison standing there, a cup of punch in hand. "Sheriff, didn't expect to see you here." Wouldn't miss it. You and Clara, you're proof that sometimes the law gets it right. That justice can actually work when good people insist on it. Morrison raised his cup in a small toast. Here's to you both. May you have all the happiness you've earned. Thank you. For everything you did. For believing Clara when you had every reason not to. I believe the evidence. The evidence just happened to support a woman who deserves support. Morrison took a sip of punch. By the way, I got word from Bitter Creek last week. Jacob Creed sold his brother's property. He's heading east, leaving the territory entirely. Said he couldn't stay in a place that reminded him of Thomas. Is that good or bad? Good, I think. He's letting go, moving on. That's healthier than holding on to hate. Morrison glanced at Clara, still dancing. We all need to know when to let go of the past and grab hold of the future. Jacob's learning. You learned months ago. The sheriff walked away, leaving Jonas with thoughts that felt more like peace than he'd known in a long time. He watched the party for a while longer, watched Samuel teach Ella to clap along with the music, watched Martin and Pete argue good-naturedly about cattle breeding, watched the community that had rallied around them celebrate not just a wedding, but a victory. Then Clara was there, pulling him onto the makeshift dance floor. You can't hide at your own wedding, Mr. Mercer. I'm not hiding, Mrs. Mercer, I'm observing. Well, observe while dancing. She fitted herself against him as the fiddle launched into a slower song, and they swayed together under the lantern light. Happy? More than I thought possible. Me too. She rested her head against his chest. Jonas, can I tell you something? Always. That first night, when I knocked on your door, I didn't think I'd live through the storm. I'd given up. I was so cold and so tired and so convinced that nothing good was left in the world. And then you opened the door. Her voice caught. You opened the door and let me in, and you saved me in ways that have nothing to do with the storm. You saved me too. This ranch, this life, it was just existing before you came. You made it living again. They danced while the stars wheeled overhead and the music played on, and their community celebrated around them. And Jonas thought about the knock that had changed everything, about the choice he'd made to open instead of close, to help instead of hide, to risk everything on a stranger who'd become the most important person in his world besides Ella. The seasons turned as they always did, indifferent to human drama. Summer came hot and bright, and Clara's garden produced enough vegetables to feed them through the year with surplus to sell. Ella took her first steps in August, stumbling between Jonas and Clara with the determined concentration of someone accomplishing the impossible. The ranch prospered in small ways. More healthy calves, better grass, repairs that actually held through storms. Fall arrived with its familiar glory, painting the mountains gold and red. Jonas and Clara worked side by side, bringing in the harvest, preserving food for winter, preparing for the cold they knew was coming. But this time, winter didn't feel like a threat. This time, they faced it together, with full stores and a warm house, and the certainty of companionship through the dark months. On a particularly crisp October evening, Jonas found Clara on the porch watching the sunset. She'd been there a while, he could tell, lost in thought. He settled beside her, and she leaned into him automatically. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Sarah, my sister, wondering what she'd think of all this. I think she'd be happy for you." "I hope so. She always wanted me to find someone good, someone who'd treat me right." Clara's hand found his. "She would have liked you. Would have liked this place, this life." "I'm sorry you lost her." "Me too. Every day." She was quiet for a moment. "But Jonas, I've been thinking, what if we gave Ella Sarah as a middle name? I know Catherine had a name picked out, and I don't want to override that, but Catherine's choice was Ella Rose. But I think Ella Sarah Rose Mercer sounds perfect. Honors both women who should have been here to see her grow up." Clara turned to look at him, eyes bright with tears. "Really? You do that?" "She's your daughter too now. You get a say in her name." "Our daughter," Clara corrected softly. "Ours." Winter came again, but it was different this time. The house that had felt like a tomb the previous year now rang with laughter and life. Clara taught Ella songs while Jonas worked on ranch accounts. They read together by the fire, played with the baby, planned for spring. And when storms came, and they always came, Jonas and Clara would stand at the window watching the wind rage, holding each other, remembering the night a knock had changed everything. "You know what I realized?" Clara said one evening during a particularly fierce blizzard. "What's that?" "The wind doesn't scare me anymore. It used to be all I could hear, this constant howling that felt like the world was angry, like nature itself was trying to kill me. But now," she gestured to the warm room, to Ella sleeping peacefully in her cradle, to Jonas beside her. "Now it's just wind, just weather. The howling is outside and we're in here, safe." "The wind stopped blowing," Jonas said, remembering the night she'd arrived. "No, the wind's still blowing. It'll always blow. That's Wyoming. But it can't touch us anymore. We built something stronger than wind." Jonas pulled her close, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones. They had built something, not just a marriage or a family, but a shelter against all the storms life could throw at them. A home made of trust and courage and the kind of love that grew, not despite hardship, but because of it. Spring returned eventually, because spring always did, bringing new life to the land. Clara's garden grew larger, more ambitious. Ella learned to talk, calling Jonas Papa and Clara Mama with equal enthusiasm. The ranch expanded slowly, carefully, always within their means, but always growing. Other things grew too. Harold Chen opened a second store and asked Clara to supply it with her embroidery. Elizabeth Brennan wrote regularly from Montana, her letters full of her own slow healing and the new life she was building. Jacob Creed sent a single letter, forwarded through Sheriff Morrison, apologizing for his actions and enclosing money to help cover the damages from the siege. Jonas used it to buy new breeding stock, turning pain into prosperity. And 2 years after that first knock, on a spring morning that smelled like fresh grass and possibility, Clara told Jonas she was pregnant. They stood together in the garden, Ella playing at their feet, and Jonas felt the familiar mixture of terror and joy that came with new life. But this time the terror was smaller, manageable. This time he knew they could handle whatever came. "Are you scared?" Clara asked, watching his face. "Terrified." "You?" "Absolutely. But Jonas, I'm also happy. So happy I don't quite know what to do with it." He kissed her forehead, then knelt to scoop up Ella, who was trying to eat dirt with the determination of a scientist conducting experiments. "You hear that, little bird? You're going to be a big sister." Ella patted his face with muddy hands and said something that might have been sister or might have been cookie. With toddlers, you could never quite tell. "We're going to need a bigger house," Clara said, looking at the ranch with calculating eyes. "And more help. Maybe we could hire someone to assist with the cattle. Give you more time with the children?" "Children, plural? That's going to take some getting used to." "We've gotten used to stranger things." She was right, of course. They'd gotten used to grief transforming into joy, to fear becoming courage, to strangers becoming family. One more change, one more growth, was just part of the pattern they'd established. The baby arrived in early winter, a boy they named Thomas Jonathan Mercer. Thomas after Reverend Thomas, who'd married them, Jonathan after Jonas's father. He was healthy and loud and looked nothing like either of them. But Jonas loved him instantly with the same fierce protectiveness he felt for Ella and Clara. "2 children," Clara said one night, nursing Thomas while Ella slept in her new bed across the room. "2 children, a thriving ranch, and a husband who still looks at me like I'm something precious. How did I get so lucky?" "You knocked on a door during a blizzard." "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Jonas corrected. "The best was saying yes when I asked you to marry me." "No, that was just inevitability. I was already yours by then, I just hadn't admitted it yet." They fell into comfortable silence, the kind that only came with years of partnership, while their children slept and the fire burned low. Outside, the wind whispered around the eaves, but inside all was warm and safe and exactly as it should be. On a summer day 5 years after Clara had first knocked on his door, Jonas stood on his porch watching his children play in the yard. Ella was 7 now, tall and serious like Catherine had been, with Jonas's stubbornness and Clara's gentle heart. Thomas was 3, all energy and chaos, determined to keep up with his sister no matter how impossible the task. Clara emerged from the house, wiping flour on her apron, and settled beside Jonas on the porch swing they'd built together the previous spring. She was pregnant again, just barely showing, though they hadn't told the children yet, and Jonas could see the way she cradled her belly unconsciously, protectively. "Remember when this place was falling apart?" Clara asked, surveying the ranch. "When you could barely keep up with the work and Ella cried all the time and everything felt impossible." "I try not to. Those weren't good days." "No, they weren't. But Jonas, look what came from them. Look what we built." She gestured to the expanded barn, the thriving garden, the new chicken coop Samuel had helped construct. "We took something broken and made it whole again. We made it better than whole. We made it home." As if to emphasize the point, a wagon came rattling up the drive. Jonas recognized it immediately. Harold Chen, making one of his regular visits to collect Clara's work and deliver supplies. But today he had passengers. A woman and 2 small children, all of them looking exhausted and frightened. Jonas and Clara exchanged a glance, understanding passing between them without words. They knew that look. They'd both worn it once. Harold climbed down from the wagon, his expression apologetic. "Jonas, Clara, I'm sorry to bring trouble, but this is Rebecca Wells and her children. They're running from a bad situation in Colorado. She needs a safe place to stay for a few days, and I thought—" "She can stay here," Clara said immediately, already moving down the porch steps. "We have room. She's welcome." Jonas followed his wife, watching her comfort the frightened woman, gather the children, begin the same process of refuge and healing that had saved her years before. And he understood then, with perfect clarity, what they'd built here. Not just a ranch, not just a family, but a place where mercy lived, where the wind couldn't blow cold enough to freeze out compassion, where doors opened instead of closed when someone knocked in desperation. This was Catherine's legacy, and Clara's gift and Jonas's promise, all woven together into something bigger than any of them individually. This was what happened when you chose kindness over caution, when you risked your own comfort to ease someone else's suffering, when you remembered that survival was just the beginning and living was the goal. That evening, after Rebecca and her children had been fed and settled in the small guest room they'd added 2 years ago, Jonas found Clara on the porch again, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "We're doing it again," she said without preamble. "Taking in someone who needs help, risking complications and gossip and all the problems that come with sheltering strangers." "I know. Are you okay with that?" Jonas thought about the question seriously, considering all the angles. Then he looked at his wife, this extraordinary woman who'd stumbled into his life during a storm and stayed to build something beautiful, and smiled. "Clara, the night you knocked on my door, I could have turned you away. I could have chosen safety over compassion, could have protected myself and Ella from risk. But I didn't. I opened that door, and it was the best decision I ever made." He took her hand. "So yes, I'm okay with it. More than okay. Because this is who we are now. This is what this place means. And I wouldn't change it for anything. Even when it's complicated? Especially when it's complicated. The best things usually are." They sat together watching the light fade, listening to their children laugh inside the house, feeling the new life growing in Clara's belly, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. The wind whispered through the cottonwood tree, gentle now, almost musical. "The wind really did stop blowing," Clara murmured. "No," Jonas corrected softly. "We just learned to build a home strong enough that the wind didn't matter anymore." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they stayed there watching night fall over the Holloway Ranch. A ranch that had survived winter and loss and violence and fear to become something better than survival. A home built on the radical notion that mercy wasn't weakness, that kindness wasn't naive, that opening your door when someone knocked was always worth the risk. Years later, when Ella asked her father to tell her about the night Mama first came to the ranch, Jonas would think carefully about how to explain it, about storms and strangers and the choice to help even when helping was dangerous, about how sometimes the people who save you are the ones you save first, about the way grief could transform into hope if you were brave enough to let it. But the heart of the story, the part he always emphasized, was simple. She knocked and he opened. Everything else, the love, the family, the home, the life they'd built together, flowed from that single moment of choosing connection over isolation, risk over safety, hope over fear. The wind had teeth that first night, teeth that could have killed. But inside, by the fire, there was warmth. There was mercy. There was a man who remembered his wife's words about not becoming stone. And there was a woman who'd survived the unsurvivable and was willing to try, one more time, to trust another human being. They'd both been broken when they met. But broken wasn't the same as bad, and broken things could be mended if you were patient and gentle and willing to do the work. So they'd done the work. They'd built a life. They'd created a home where the wind couldn't reach, where children laughed and strangers found safety and love grew in the spaces grief had carved out. And every night, when Jonas locked the door before bed, he'd think about that first knock, about the choice he'd made to answer instead of ignore, about how a single moment of compassion had transformed everything. The wind still blew across Wyoming territory, harsh and unforgiving, carving the land into something beautiful and terrible. But inside the Holloway Ranch, in the house that Jonas and Catherine had started and Jonas and Clara had completed, there was warmth. There was family. There was love that had earned its place through trial and courage and the stubborn refusal to let hardship win. The wind still blew, but they'd built something stronger than wind. They'd built a home. And that, Jonas thought every night as he checked on his sleeping children and kissed his wife goodnight, was worth more than all the safety in the world. Worth every risk he'd taken. Worth every moment of fear and uncertainty. Because she'd knocked at midnight, and he'd opened the door, and the wind had finally stopped blowing.